turnout for the exciting discussions that we have planned today, looking at a really important moment in Colorado history. My name is Jayla Poppleton. I'm the Executive Director at Water Education Colorado, and our organization is dedicated to advancing awareness and informed decision-making on water issues, the critical role that water plays in our economy, our environment, and our overall quality of life. We're currently reaching more than 20,000 people every year with quality resources, programs, reporting, and trainings to advance informed dialogue and decision-making on water. And our ultimate goal is to get to sustainable solutions. We're just one of your hosts today. We've worked with two great partners to bring this event to you, and that includes Colorado Trout Unlimited and the One World, One Water Center at Metro State University. Colorado Trout Unlimited is the state's leading nonprofit, nonpartisan organization providing a voice for Colorado's rivers and trout. As the grassroots arm of the national organization, Colorado TU leverages the power of 11,000 members from 24 chapters across Colorado to conserve, protect, and restore fisheries and their watersheds. The One World, One Water Center is a collaboration between Metropolitan State University and the Denver Botanic Gardens. The partnership presents opportunities to expand joint initiatives on water issues through research, design innovation, experiential learning, and other projects. The OWOW Center also hosts 3 academic water studies programs. So together, we're excited about today's program for a few reasons. First and foremost, the lineup of panelists that you're going to get to hear from, some of whom have traveled long distances to be here with us today. These are individuals who have made and are continuing to make history in Colorado water from a variety of different vantage points. And you'll find their detailed biographies in your event program. We're also excited to have 2 respected journalists moderating these discussions. They're going to help guide a conversation where we can dig into the past, explore the path that we've been on, and see what lessons we can draw on to help us today. We're grateful to the History Colorado Center for providing this great venue and for reaching out to their members to help us reach a wider audience for today's event. And we're also thankful to our sponsors for providing the financial support to make this event possible and accessible to students and community members, as well as folks from the water industry. So please help me in thanking presenting sponsor, the Buyers Group, as well as our breakfast sponsors, Denver Water and the South Metro Water Supply Authority, and our community sponsors, which include American Rivers, the College of Professional Studies at Metro State University of Denver, HDR, and Lamp Rynearson. Thank you all. So I want to just let you know that you feel free to get up and help yourself to any of the food and beverages if you didn't get a chance already, but please try to keep talking and disruptions to a minimum, as we will be video recording these conversations. We'll have a short break at 10 to 10:15 between our panels, which will be another opportunity to grab refreshments and mingle. And so without further ado, I would like to bring up the wonderful Tom Check to set the stage for today's program. Just a little bit about Tom. He's an author with a teaching background who was the director for the Central Colorado Water Conservancy District in Greeley previously. His books are tremendously helpful resources with titles such as Colorado Water Law for Non-Lawyers and The Principles of Colorado Water Resources. He has taught both graduate and undergraduate level courses in water, and he now leads the One World, One Water Center for Urban Water Education and Stewardship at Metropolitan State University of Denver. Tom was instrumental in the establishment of our organization 17 years ago and continues to commit himself to water education, and we're all fortunate to have him in our community. So Tom, come on up, and I hope you all enjoy the program.
Morning, everybody. Can you hear? Oh, there we go. Thanks, everyone, for being here. And before I start, I wanted to thank David Nickham. Where are you, David? You were kind of the brains behind starting this whole thing, which is a wonderful idea. Jayla, who helped put the event together, and Nona Shipman, who was very much involved in planning everything, and Dan Lukey was in the middle of the organization the last couple of months. So thank you to those 4, please. Okay, so the Two Forks veto, what was it and why is it important? Who was around back in the early 1990s when the veto occurred? So quite a few. That's good. The veto and the Two Forks Project had its origins with this group of people. 1859, the Colorado Gold Rush. About 100,000 folks came out here looking for gold in the mountains, and they congregated in Denver to start that work. And what they found out quickly is that they needed water for the mining and so forth. They needed water to drink. I mean, when you come out here and you have that big a bunch of people coming out to Colorado, 100,000, you got to find a source of water. So what happened quite quickly between the 1860s and 1890s, lots of people, a lot of entrepreneurs, constructed irrigation canals to grow food because the miners had to eat. And this was a food desert back in the 1860s. There was no grocery store to go to. You had to either shoot it or find something wild or grow it yourself. So irrigation was a big deal. And these canals were also developed to provide water supply for the growing Denver area in the late 1800s. Now this is nothing new. Anytime an area gets settled, usually people drill wells and they'll use groundwater to drink and to use in their homes. It usually gets polluted pretty quick. If you look at the history of New York City or other places around the world, wells get polluted, so you got to find other sources of water. So in the early 1900s, we'll go to that one in a second. Early 1900s, Denver Water had its origins to provide safe drinking water to our region, to the Denver area. Safe drinking water means it has to be filtered to some degree and treated in some way, or else it could have a lot of contaminants. So that's early 1900s. The first city to provide treated drinking water in the world was Paisley, Scotland, in the year 1804. 1804. Paris, France starts doing this about 1806. Denver comes along about 100 years later and knows from all the typhoid epidemics and the sicknesses and illness in Europe and around the world, you have to have treated drinking water. So providing treated water to an urban population is a pretty big deal, because if you don't, you may end up having 50% of the people die from illness. So water supply is a big deal. Okay, so early 1900s, mid-1900s, reservoirs are getting built, water projects are being developed, and that's just the way the pattern was for water development in the United States. That's just how it happened. Well, then we kind of hit a point around the 1970s, 1980s, where there were a lot of people moving here from other places. And as we see today, our population is 5.6 million. Anticipate a population of about 7.1 million by the year 2030. That's a lot of people coming here. And how do you know it's coming? Well, if you drive down I-25 from the north, in March, I ride the Mustang from Fort Collins. I counted the construction cranes in downtown Denver last March. I counted 32. And the record before that had been 26, like the fall before. I hit 32 and I just quit. It's like, okay, there's a whole bunch of people coming here. That's why they're building HOV lanes and building housing downtown. A lot of people moving here. If you're the water provider for a region like this, you better have a water supply so when they turn on the tap, water comes out the tap and it's safe. That's just what you do as a water provider. So a lot of people coming here. I wanted to ask, how many people here grew up in Colorado? Oh, that's pathetic. That's like 25%. It just gets worse every year. So 75% of us in this room grew up somewhere else. So what that tells us is, if we all went back home where we came from, there would be no water problem here. So the water problem in Colorado is created by us who moved here from somewhere else. And for example, I moved here from back east from Nebraska. Anybody here from Nebraska? Yeah. Anybody here been to Nebraska? On purpose. Yeah. A lot of people coming here. And if you're the water provider, you have to provide water to drink. Where are you going to get it from? Well, one idea in the 1970s and 80s was, let's build a great big reservoir southwest of Denver near Deckers, Colorado. And is it on the south? It's at the confluence of the north and the south tributaries of the Platte River, South Platte River. Big honking reservoir. This sucker is going to be big. It was, I believe, the largest proposed reservoir in the US at the time, I believe. This is an article from the Denver Post in the year 2000, 10 years after the Two Forks veto. And this is the only picture, a decent picture I could find online of the site. Denver Post Archives, June 24th, 1974. The dotted line shows the height of the reservoir. Now keep things in context and perspective. When did the environmental movement occur in the US? So late 1960s. That's when you had all the hippies and that kind of stuff and Woodstock and those sorts of things. When was the US EPA started? 1970. Well, 2, and I think Nixon signed it 73, or it came into effect in January 1st. 70. You would know, yes. So the EPA gets formed in 1970. Who was the president that signed it into law? Nixon, of all people. Good Lord. Yeah, and then I think on the first Earth Day, which was a few years later, Nixon on that day declared it National Archery Day, I believe. The first Earth Day. And that's a whole different discussion. So the environmental movement, early 70s, environmental protection and awareness is coming along, and that is a big change from the way things had been done previously in terms of the water development world. Previous to that, you'd get your sponsor in Congress, you'd get the money like with Representative Aspinall from Colorado, you get your money, you build the thing, and you're done. Well, now there's awareness about environmental protection. So I just pulled up some newspaper articles from online. This is the New York Times, November 24th, 1990, with the veto going to happen. So this is news in the New York Times. And some other newspapers, Chicago Tribune, LA Times, Washington Post, High Country News. This was a big deal when this veto occurred. Now backtrack. So before the EPA, building a reservoir was a lot less. It did not involve as many permitting processes. And so with the EPA and the environmental impact statements and so forth, environmental protection, you had to get permits to construct a project like this to show that you were doing the best you can to protect the environment, basically. Well, so when this permit was vetoed, this was like an incredible wake-up call to the water development community. It's like, wow, no longer business as usual. What are we going to do now? There were some big players involved in this veto process. And the veto process, and the panels will talk about this, this was many, many years in the makings. You had Governor Romer, he was the governor at the time. Bill Riley was in the middle of this. Dan Lukey was involved in this. I mean, there were a lot of big-time players involved in trying to get this project stopped for a variety of reasons. And you got Denver Water on the other side, and the metropolitan water providers, I think that's 40 water organizations that were pushing as hard as they could to get the thing built. And imagine 40 governmental agencies in the Denver metro area banding together on one idea to build something. That's a lot of political power and a lot of money involved to try to get the thing built. And it was stopped. So I want to leave you with just a couple thoughts. The panelists that come up are going to talk about the Two Forks veto, and I want you all to keep their comments in context. When they were working in their positions back in the day, in the 90s and the 80s and so forth, they were doing the best job they could to work toward the goals of their organization. There's no good people, bad people involved in this thing. There are people that have different ideas or opinions of how to solve a problem. Problem is, we don't have enough water in our dry desert region, and a whole bunch of people are moving here. Where do we get the water? And that's the debate. It's the debate that's going on today for all of us is as these 1 million or 2 million people come here like we did, like most of us did, where's the water going to come from? And we live in a dry place. We have droughts. So how do you provide the water for the new population coming here and protect the environment? Those are the big challenges. And as these panelists talk, they're fully aware of what's at stake, and they're doing what they feel is best for their organization. That's just the way it works. We all do that with our jobs. We do what's best for our organization, and we truly believe it. So what's the future challenges? Population growth, that was a challenge in the 70s and 80s, and it still is today for our region. And how do you protect the environment? That's a really tough combination to work through. So again, really excited to hear the panelists and to hear their background and perspectives. And as you hear them talk, try to put it in the context of today and the different water projects that are proposed in our region, and how do we work our way through those debates today. Maybe we get some ideas and advice from history and from the comments of our panelists. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Tom. With that, I'd like to bring up our first panel. So welcome to the stage. And I will be giving you very brief introductions of all of our panelists. We have Bill Riley, who was the former EPA administrator at the time that the veto was cast in 1990. Luana Wilcher, who was the former EPA assistant administrator for water, working with Bill, who issued the final determination for that veto. Dave Little, who's the former Denver Water Director of Planning, who'd been working on the Two Forks project at the time, and afterward worked on many initiatives to figure out where Denver Water was going to go from there. Dan Lukey, who was the former Environmental Defense Fund Rocky Mountain Office Director, and in that context led some of the environmental opposition to the Two Forks project. And Dave Wyman, who was an independent lobbyist working in DC at the time, and he's going to tell you more of his story. And moderating this panel is Mark Omasic, who was a Denver Post reporter covering the rise and fall of Two Forks. So with that, I turn it over to Mark. Thank you.
Not yet. There we go. All right. Thanks a million for coming. Who'd have thunk that we'd ever be old enough to be part of a history exhibit? Right? What a terrific thing for TU to do, to take a look at the past and try to learn some lessons as we move forward. I had moved to Colorado in 1985 with the instructions that I was going to cover a really nasty and bitter Senate race, which I did. It was Tim Wirth versus Ken Kramer, and that race beat me up. And so I asked my editor for a break. I wanted to get far away from politics, and they said, great, go cover the environment. No change there. I'd like to set the stage a little bit for the time. It was really a different era in politics. Republicans and Democrats really worked together a lot more and a lot better than is happening now. At the time, Ronald Reagan was president and actually had stocked his administration with many people from here in Denver. James Watt came out of the Mountain States Legal Foundation and had made, I guess, he was a leader of the Sagebrush Rebellion, which he was really skeptical about wilderness, promoted development of federal land, oil, mining. The head of the EPA was a woman who came out of the Colorado House, Ann Gorsuch, Ann Burford, and came in, cut the EPA's budget by 22%, and went to, had brought fewer prosecutions against polluters, and ended up getting in a big fight with Congress over releasing Superfund records. And so the Reagan administration at that point had a reputation for not being a friend of the environmental movement. 1988, enter George Bush, who had been Reagan's vice president. Bush had actually campaigned saying that he wanted to be known as the environment president, and established a national EPA director that was a dramatic difference from Ann Burford, named William Riley, who came out of the World Wildlife Federation. And so we'll go down the panel. Each panelist, starting with Mr. Riley, I guess, we'll talk about maybe 10 minutes about where you came from and what happened with Two Forks. Mr. Riley.
Thank you. You set this up very well. I, as was mentioned, was a conservationist, career conservationist.
I had been in the Nixon White House at the Council on Environmental Quality under Russell Train. I'd been in charge of land use and, well, Exxon, or what was it? I guess it was the Alaska pipeline that kind of formed my impressions of the West and pros and cons of that development there. And then headed the Conservation Foundation and the World Wildlife Fund after they merged. So I came to the issues with a predisposition to respect natural resources in the environment from a conservationist perspective, and was particularly moved by the Science Advisory Board of EPA, a very distinguished group of scientists who recommended a number of things, among which was I'd asked the question, what are the major threats to the health and to the ecology of the United States? And to what degree do the EPA priorities, as reflected in our budget, conform to those priorities? And ecology, wetlands, estuaries were specifically mentioned as major priorities that affected the country, that were being transformed, and that needed protection. So I already had that predisposition, but the scientists reinforced it. And that was something that I had actually indicated I would promote before I even took office. As soon as I was announced, I think on December 22nd, 1988, I received a call from the Environmental Defense Fund. I received a lot of calls. Everybody wanted to prepare me for my new role. And so I had a couple of hours of briefing at the World Wildlife Fund on something called the Two Forks Dam, which I had never heard. I was a little surprised to see the size of the dam and remarked that I had not heard about it, but I hadn't. On my first day in office, I learned this, by the way, preparing for this conference, my first day in office, I had a meeting with the regional administrator, Jim Scherer. And seeing that I was questioning the premises of the project, very much in the way I had been briefed by the Environmental Defense Fund, he became alarmed, and he said, you know, this has been approved by all levels of government. The governor's behind it, the mayor is behind it, the regional office is behind it, your water staff supports this. Your timing is not the best. I remember looking at him and saying, and thinking to myself, I'm a raw new administrator. I have found the men's room, but your timing is not the best. I said, you could have cleaned this up if this is a project of such importance and such unanimous support. Odd that it comes to me. The question that I have had looking back is the role of the White House. Was quite nervous about it, the chief of staff especially. He later said, I wish to heaven I'd never heard of Two Forks. I said, well, I wish you'd never heard of Two Forks too. He was not a supporter of my decision. But I think from a political perspective, it was difficult for the president, because once it was known that I was very seriously interested in the details of this project, for the White House then to allow it or direct that it be permitted to go forward would not have been consistent with the president's wish to be the environmental president. They certainly did not want to antagonize the Republican leadership in Colorado by opposing it. So it was my baby, and that was fine. When I began to look at it, the first thing that I noticed was that the population and usage, water need numbers looked very high. First of all, probably few remember, but Denver was losing population in those days. So the idea of projecting very significant increases related on per capita use was questionable. Secondly, the Corps of Engineers figures had a 20% increase in per capita water use. I was also aware, I think it was Senator Worth who talked about the foothills agreements that had not been honored, and I was aware also there was no metering in Denver. And I remember the arguments that were made for the project. There were essentially three, as I recall. One was a number of colorful congressmen it's none of your damn business. You don't have any money in this project. It's a $1 billion project. We're going to pay for it ourselves. That was one. And, you know, it did seem very surprising when I finally did the veto to a lot of people that we would take that action with respect to a project that was not a federal project. However, the Clean Water Act made quite clear the responsibilities we had to protect water, recreation, wetlands. And it struck me that statutorily I had every right to inquire into this issue. EPA's approval was required anyway. Secondly, the question of population increase, preparing for the future, supporting the growth of the region, making sure that the suburbs did not go far afield to buy water rights from farmers and dry up some of the rural counties. And third, something that I remember was put by the governor directly to me on the edge of a governor's meeting in Washington. He said, I never forgot this phrase. He said, "We don't need the water, we need the project." And what he meant was to knit the communities together, to give a codependency between the suburbs and the city. The water was going to be the glue. And from the point of view of urban planning, metropolitan development, and unity, that made a lot of sense. I understood that. The extraordinary thing to me was in almost all of the conversations I had, almost no one, and perhaps I had more conversations with those who were for the project than who were against it, no one spoke rhapsodically of the resource. It was a place that I came to understand without having visited was exquisite. It was marvelously labeled the St. Peter's of trout fishing. And as I said last night to somebody, I half expected that Fred Krupp and the Environmental Defense Fund would bring in the Pope before it was over to oppose the project. It was those things, though. When I inquired of fishermen and people who really knew the area, it was an extraordinarily important, beautiful resource. And so there was every reason to take it seriously and to ask, is it really necessary? There was no water crisis. The projections showed that there would not be a specific need for the water for 20, 25 years, and that was without the efficiency, the conservation measures that had yet to be taken. And we all know that cities like Seattle, Los Angeles, many others have in some cases doubled their population without increasing their water use. So there were great opportunities certainly to prove before taking a resource of that magnitude that it was absolutely necessary, but there was no crisis. The decision that I made was to start the veto process, and we had first to have a regional administrator, Lee DeHines, confirm that all of this was merited. The structure of EPA was very carefully designed to work against any precipitous decision of such magnitude. And then the decision went to the assistant administrator for water, sitting to my right, Luana Wiltshire. By the way, when I engaged her, I had her hiring interview. I had already made the decision to start the veto, and I asked her the question. I said, "So what did you think of my Two Forks decision?" And she sat up very straight. She looked out the window. She said, "I think it was a big mistake." And I said, "Well, you have my full attention." And I can't believe I hired her, actually, after that. Because certainly my reputation was hanging in the balance for the next year while she considered what she was going to do. And she said, "I think it's too heavy a load. I don't think she'd been at the agency, knew it better than I do, had been there in the Reagan years. I don't think the agency can withstand it." But at any rate, I did hire her. I saw in her objectivity, integrity, and strength. And that's certainly what we got. Once the decision was made, there was a strong backlash, especially among Republican circles in Colorado. And the chairman of the Republican Party, Lee Atwater, who had been the campaign manager for President Bush, attacked me in the newspapers in Colorado and my decision, and so did Neil Bush, the president's son. And I went over to see Atwater when he came back to Washington, and he was a little guy, and he was feisty man, and he was standing up with his hands up. He said, in front of a bookcase, he said, "I'm innocent, I'm innocent." And he said, "Well, I'm not innocent." But he said, "I'm gonna be innocent." He said, "Look, I had to do that. You've driven those guys crazy out there. They're furious. But the mail is running 7-1 in your favor at the White House." And I remember the communications director for the White House said, "You know, there are 30 million fishermen," and he was one of them in this country. And it surprised the White House. It surprised me. I had not been party to the organization of the response. I was fantastically delighted to discover it. And then it dawned on me, became very clear that my friends in the environmental field were doing this, that Dave Wyman was one of them. There were people here who were active in it, Jay Hare at the National Wildlife Federation. But all of this was not part of what I was doing, nor could I have been seen to do it, actually. I had to keep quiet once I made the decision, and I had no conversation at all, not one, with Luana during the entire period she was inquiring into this. I guess I'm probably used my 10 minutes. I just say there were some reactions that surprised me. One, I was in conversation at the home of Moss Secretary Bob Mossbacher, who was Commerce Secretary. And we were in a little circle with the Agriculture Secretary, the Interior Secretary, and the Defense Secretary. And it was the Secretary of Defense, who was an avid fisherman, who said, "Your Two Forks decision," and I particularly appreciated he said it in front of the others, "was absolutely the right decision." He said, "For many years in Congress, I held my nose or looked the other way when I voted for certain water projects." And he said, "I think the era of those wasteful water projects is over. I think you finished it." And the question that I really have here that I would like to hear those of you who know so much more about this than I do address is that true? Did it? Did it have a lasting impact? As we very much hoped, I very much hoped that it would have. That defense secretary, by the way, was Dick Cheney. And I think, shall I tell the story? No, I told it last night. There was someone else. How many of you were there last night? Well, some people have asked, did you get adequately thanked for the project? Well, that one of those pictures up there, I was visiting the site after the dust had settled. In 90, I think, late 90, it was a winter time, I believe, maybe it was spring. And I visited Cheeseman Canyon. And there was a fisherman, mid-20s, so his truck was stuck in the snow. And Chris Dirksen, another fisherman, a good friend of mine who worked for me at the Conservation Foundation, Chris and I helped pull this fellow out of the snow. And he had a bumper sticker, Two Forks with a slash through it. And so Chris said, "This is the guy that did the veto of the dam." And this man looked at me with just rhapsodic admiration, very excited, and he said, "Well, damn." He said, "So you did that." He said, "You know, I've got some really first-class shit up in my cabin. And I wouldn't share that with anybody, but if you'll come up to my cabin, I'll share it with you." And I so wanted to go back and tell the president how much he was appreciated and how I was sure that fellow voted Republican. At any rate, yes, I was very well and emotionally thanked. Thank you.
Well, that's terrific. And of course, with the passage of time, that really good shit is legal in Colorado now. There's so many memories from here. I remember as a newspaper reporter, every time you'd write about Two Forks, you'd have to say that this project would provide a water supply for an extra, I think it was 400,000 new city residents with the yield of this project, 615-foot dam that they would build near the confluence of the North Fork and the main stem of the South Platte. And every time I wrote that, I remembered that this project would provide a new water supply for 400,000 new residents. I'd get a call from Dave Taylor over at Trout Unlimited who would say, "And the best trout stream within an hour's drive of any major metropolitan area in North America." Now, Mr. Riley had mentioned that actually it was T.R. Reed, Tom Reed of the Washington Post, who called this stretch of River Cheeseman Canyon, he called it the St. Peter's Basilica of trout fishing. And, you know, I've probably, like a lot of people in this room, I've spent my fair share of time in Cheeseman Canyon, and I have never heard that much swearing in St. Peter's Basilica. Those are tough fish. If you can, if you can get a size 28 midge on your 7X or 8X tippet, you're in pretty good shape. I didn't need reading glasses back then to do it, but now here we are. So let's hear from Dave Little at the Denver Water Board about what the Water Board's original intent was with the project and what it learned from Mr. Riley's decision.
Good morning. I find myself in a very interesting situation here on this panel, which, and this has been an interesting time for me trying to remember back that far. I worked on the Two Forks project for 8 years of my 35-year career. And those other 27 years of my career, we did some amazing things at Denver Water that had nothing to do with Two Forks. In fact, some people will talk later today about the wonderful things that have happened since Two Forks. But I was a foot soldier during the Two Forks time, as was Lee, as was Dan, although Dan was a little bit more involved in politics, I think, than some of us. But what I remember from that time was Denver Water as an organization had been moving forward for 70 years, 60, 70 years, with a single purpose. And that single purpose was to provide a reliable, clean, sustainable water supply for a growing metropolitan area. That single purpose led itself to a very eloquent engineering solution, or engineering solutions. And if you look at Denver Water's history up to the Two Forks time, Denver Water traditionally would build treatment capacity and then build a reservoir, build treatment capacity and then build a reservoir. And that's the path that we were on at that time. So when it became time for the next reservoir, Two Forks was on the line. In fact, there was a lot of discussion about whether we were going to do Two Forks or the Eagle Piney project, which would have, recognizing in hindsight the controversy of Two Forks, I can only imagine what it would have been like to try to build Eagle Piney in the wilderness area. So we decided to build Two Forks. So we started moving forward on Two Forks. What happened with the veto, and I think of this more as a continuum than a discrete effort. The veto was very important in the life of Denver Water, but it was not the defining moment for Denver Water. It was an inflection point on a continuum. What the veto did was it eliminated, in essence, the engineering solution that would solve, to a large extent, the water supply needs of the Denver metropolitan area. And that's all Denver Water was trying to do. It was trying to move towards that goal that it had been moving towards for the last 60 years, to try to make sure that it had a viable water supply for the Denver metropolitan area. What we did not recognize at that time was that the world was changing. We were on very unsure footing because all the environmental laws were just starting to come into effect. I remember talking with the Corps of Engineers as they were moving through the EIS, and they basically said, you know, we're making some of this up as we go along because it's all new. All this stuff is new for us. And we were making it up too. We viewed the environmental community as just being, in essence, obstructionists, trying to stop us from doing God's work. So we never had a dialogue. We never had a conversation on what was important to the environmental community and what was important to the Denver metropolitan area. We just viewed them as being in the way. So we couldn't come to any common understanding of what was important and how best to supply the water needs for the Denver metropolitan area. I remember that the environmental community put out a report. I still can't remember the name of that report, Dan.
I think it was called The Best Plan for the Future of Water in Colorado. I think that was the name.
It was probably something like that. But what we called it at Denver Water was the green weenie. And that gives you a good indication of what our thinking was at the time, because the environmental community was in the way of what we viewed as what was necessary for a growing metropolitan area. Now, when I retired, which I'm happy to say is approaching 4 years now from Denver Water, first of all, I realized that I'll never accept another one of these speaking engagements because it's drawn me right back into the stress of the work environment, and I don't want to go there anymore because it's really fun in being retired. But when I retired, I started going through all my records, and I found the Green Weenie, and I started to read it. And what became evident to me, and this is directly related to the Two Forks veto, what became evident to me is Denver Water, since the Two Forks veto, has in essence implemented almost everything that was in that document. From the reuse of water, from the wonderful conservation program, where we're nationally recognized for our conservation program, for the sensitive way that we look at additional water supply development and our environmental stewardship that we proceed with. So what the veto did for Denver Water, in essence, was move our mission from getting from point A to point B in an engineering standpoint to a more broad approach, an integrated planning approach, if you will, that takes into consideration all the issues that are associated with water supply development, the environment, and the growth that's occurring in Denver, which is tremendous growth. So the veto was an inflection point for Denver Water, and it has made us a better organization. I cannot imagine what would happen if the veto would not have occurred. I can only envision the fact that we would have built that project probably, and then Denver would have not been challenged to be creative and to do some of the great things that we've done since that time. So I'd like to thank all my opposition on the panel for allowing us to be such a good organization and showing us that there are other ways of developing water resources and working with environmental issues in a way that is not a war.
Huh. That's terrific. So let's hear from the Green Weenie himself. Dan Lukey, environmental obstructionist. Tell us, what got you going about Two Forks?
Dave Little. When I first joined the Environmental Defense Fund in 1980, it was just after a big fight in the previous decade had taken place here, the Foothills fight over a treatment plant. And the essence of the fight was a fight about the relationship between water supply and growth. And I feel it's one of the most important things I did, not having been part of that fight, coming in afterwards, was to get the environmental community to realize that there is a very weak link between water and growth. You can't stimulate growth with water, nor can you constrain growth with water. A city is not a garden. It's fundamentally a different kind of economy. If you want to grow, put in a transportation system. If you want to grow, invest in universities and education. If you want to grow, invest in social services. You won't grow with water, nor can you stop it. And that had been the essence of that fight. And I think that the environmental community came to see this and to then say, okay, well, do we have something, if we're not going to fight about growth in water, then can we take on a notion of how to meet legitimate needs for water in a way that's environmentally sound? And I think we thought that we were going to be a group of smart people who could tell Denver and others how to run their systems. There was nothing we discovered, if you will, that they didn't already know. They just kind of kept things in their back pocket because, as David said, Two Forks was next on the agenda. That's what they wanted to do. He mentioned Eagle Piney, a project on the west slope that would have invaded a wilderness area. What got it started on the round associated with Two Forks was when Ronald Reagan was elected president, Denver immediately raced to Washington, D.C. to get an exemption from the president to invade a wilderness area. That got the attention of some Democrats in Colorado, the governor, Lamb, and one of the senators, Gary Hart, both of whom had elections coming up. And had that Eagle Piney project, or the effort for an exemption, had that really taken hold, they knew that Colorado would be fighting a national environmental issue. It wouldn't have been Colorado specific. They started a process called the Roundtable, and as we entered that process, we thought, again, with the suburbs and with Denver and with other water interests, we were going to offer an alternative to Two Forks and the invasion of a wilderness area. But I can remember a conversation I had with one of the suburban utilities as we were laying out our plan for them. And this fellow said to me, and what water rights do you control? I mean, what we were doing is we were offering Denver's water to these suburbs as though we could offer Denver's water to these suburbs. And they had no interest in dealing with us, no interest in playing with us. And so it was at that point that I think we turned our attention more to the EIS process. You heard David talk about getting from point A to point B. At one point we had a conversation with the Corps of Engineers. This was after the green weenie was fully developed and vetted, and after we'd actually given our computer model to the Army Corps of Engineers to use in the context of the EIS analysis. And the fellow's name was Dick Gorton. He was the director, I'm not sure that was his exact title, the director for the Corps of Engineers review of the EIS process. And he said, you know, you enviros really have some good ideas here. He says, but our job is not really to offer alternatives. Our job is to get from point A to point B. And point B is a permit, a 404 permit. So that's where we're headed. And you're not going to stop it with your alternative. You're not going to stop it with your approach, whatever it may happen to be. But by that time, I feel as though we really had captured the attention of EPA, particularly at the staff level. There was some real interest in looking at a serious alternative. The staff of EPA in this region actually took our alternative, gave it to an outside engineering firm, and asked, does this make sense technically? Does it make sense economically? Does it make sense financially? Is it a preferable alternative if you can step back from the politics of that? And this engineering firm came back and said, yes, it is. And so that, in a way, legitimized what we thought was a good idea. But it was not as though we invented anything. It was merely that we knew or had Denver admit to what it could accomplish without a big project like Two Forks. And I think that as Dave talks about what we had to offer, that it wasn't really our offer, it was just helping get Denver to move on a path different from the one that it had originally wanted to take.
Great. Dave Wyman, what were the politics of this, and how did a local water project get to be a national environmental and political issue? Sure.
This thing working? Okay. Good Friday, 1989, early days of the Bush administration. I had access to the AP wire, the real AP wire, not the finished stories, but the stories as they were formulating. And I was reading it, and a flash came across that Mr. Riley at EPA had initiated a veto of the Two Forks Water Project. And that caught my attention. It was just a two-liner, and the story on the AP wire would start developing over the next couple of hours. And I read this, and I went, uh-oh. And I did that because I'm a veteran of the Carter hit list, the fights in North Dakota over Garrison, Milwaukee in South Dakota, the California water issues, and so on. And I knew one of the mistakes that was made during the Carter years and with the Carter hit list is they allowed the opponents to control the narrative by never involving directly the critics of many of these projects. Carter had campaigned around the country, discovered people all over the country had problems with water development, the very problems that you were describing, and the very culture that took us. We go from point A to point B. That was replicated. That's not exclusive to Colorado. That was replicated all over the country. Carter ran into that during his campaign, and so he took a hard position. And the first opportunity to do something was to send up the budget amendment in February. And I had worked behind the scenes along with others. Brent Blackwelder was prominent among those. Some of you know him. But we didn't get a heads up. And we had no ability to mobilize political support. Now, I've contributed nothing to the economic analysis, the hydrologic analysis, the work that Dan's talked about, and the reports. I had absolutely nothing to do with any of those, but I had everything to do with the campaigns, the political campaigns that went along with them. And as I watched this AP story, I started making phone calls to people around the country saying, take a look at this. And at the bottom of that story, several hours later, as you get, the way the stories form is you get the basics of the story, and then you get the reactions down at the bottom. And some of the environmentalists here in Colorado were being quoted saying, we won. And I'm going, uh-oh. They didn't win anything. Because what EPA did was create a process, a new process. So if you have supporters and the message was you won, you say, okay, well, now we'll go deal with parks, or now we'll go deal with highway issues or whatever. And another little part of the story, which I learned from Mr. Riley later, is, remember this was Good Friday. He made his decision, he signed his papers. EPA's administrator's office in those days was on the 12th floor of the Waterside building. He got up, he went to the window, he's looking down over the Potomac. He said, this is what decision-making is all about, choosing, selecting. And his door, there was a knock on his door, his chief of staff, Gordon Binder, put his head in and said, Mr. Riley, we have a report of an oil spill in Alaska, a tanker went aground. And so the confluence of what happened in Alaska and the Two Forks decision are bound by a common day. Mr. Riley went to Easter dinner 2 days later and was sharing, what did you do this week? And when he got to the part about Two Forks, one of the guests at the dinner said, you did what? And suggested to Mr. Riley that he make a phone call before he took off his jacket the next morning. And he scribbled on a piece of paper a phone number, and it was my phone number. And indeed, he called me first thing Monday morning. And by then, I had been following the reaction of the story all weekend. I'd been talking to people all over the country all weekend. And I knew one thing, that George Herbert Walker Bush, the Bush administration, Mr. Riley and EPA basically created the first major issue that we would have to deal with in the environmental community, and that we had to do one thing and one thing alone, and that is we had to get you some support. And so that's what my focus became. Talked to a group of people. We decided to put a campaign together. There were a lot of discussions. A suggestion was made to put a canvas together in Colorado, a door-to-door canvas. The National Wildlife Federation said, we'll pay for it, we'll do it, and then they didn't. I turned around and raised $100,000, went to Clean Water Action. Clean Water Action created Colorado Clean Water Action and put a wonderful woman named Carmi McLean in charge. And we did a couple of things. And, where's the second slide? Or, I don't have it. David, hold the mic a little closer. Thank you. Or just click, yeah, just. We did two primary things with clean water. One is we wrote a report. Now, it's not like the report that Mr. Lukey would prepare or some of the other groups. We wanted a report that showed what the problems were. And that report had one target audience: all of the bond houses that would fund Two Forks. And we put a cover letter on it. And the cover letter referenced a ruling by the SEC that grew out of what happened in the Pacific Northwest. Anybody remember Whoops and the failure, the collapse of the bonds, the failure for those projects? Well, the SEC prepared a rule and changed the ballgame and made the bond houses responsible for what was in a prospectus. And then we put a cover letter together and we sent it off to 20, 30, or 40 different bond houses. And we wanted to make sure that the Denver Water Board got a copy of that report, because we wanted the Denver Water Board to start running over to the bond houses and saying, wait a minute. And while they did that, the canvas was going door to door, knocking on doors. And so give me one more click. Okay, so the first is we prepared a short report and then circulated it, and then give me another hit there. And then the canvas had 3 targets. The first target was the Clean Water Act process that EPA put together, and we encouraged Coloradans to report how they feel. And what we were doing is not persuading people. People had fixed opinions. One of the things that was fascinating is the polling was based, there was a lot of polling about Two Forks. 50% opposed, 25% supported, 25% had no opinion. That meant every canvasser had 3 out of 4 doors had a supporter or a persuadable. And we had people who wanted to have their views known, but had no way to do it. So the canvas gave voice to people who had an opinion. And the first thing they did is one of the things they did is they contacted the EPA process that was being run under Luana Wiltshire, and they filed comments. The second thing they did is, I happen to know that George Herbert Walker Bush, about once a month, would go down to the basement of the old executive office building, and the old executive office building had a mailroom. And the president would walk in, very informal, and he would turn to the staff and say, what are the people of the United States telling their president? Well, we anticipated that, and we invited the canvassers to communicate with the White House. And as you pointed out, the 7-to-1 ratio and whatever it was, what we did for a period of time, and all of this mail came from Coloradans. It's not like, Floridians against Two Forks, or, Mainers against Two Forks. It was Coloradans. And that point was made that, Mr. President, there's this ton of mail, and it's all from Colorado, and it's saying things like, thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for giving us Bill Riley. Thank you for that veto. And we knew, and at one point, the most mail that came into the White House mailroom on any issue any issue was from Colorado on Two Forks, thanking Mr. Riley and his team. And that blew away the White House. A story that Mr. Riley shared with me some years ago, and he referenced Lee Atwater. Lee Atwater was called by power people out here. They said, "We don't like what this guy Riley's doing." And Lee Atwater got into the press and said, "Well, there's something wrong. I'm going to go back to Washington and fix it up." And Mr. Riley, as a member of the cabinet, was routinely invited to White House affairs. So he goes to a White House affair shortly thereafter. He's in a room, big reception, and across the room is Lee Atwater, and he's heading that way. He takes Mr. Riley and says, "Can we go down the hall? We need to talk." I'm not going to describe your reaction. You can do that. He knew he was in trouble. He went down the hall, went into a private room, and Lee Atwater said, "You're one of the most dangerous persons in the cabinet of George Herbert Walker Bush because you have a constituency. You're not going to get any other blowback from me." The value of a constituency, the value of people who had a voice, creating a process through which that voice was allowed to speak. The third thing the canvas did is it targeted 8 members of the Denver City Council. Now, the first response from the members of the Denver City Council was, "Hey guys, you're knocking on the wrong door. You should be knocking on the door of the Denver Water Board." And the response was, "Who votes to approve the bonds that the Denver Water Board will use?" And that was the role of the city council. You know, in the I don't know how many years this all took place, but years and years and years, probably the Denver City Council had an afternoon's work to deal with that project. And they would have to vote on the bonds. We did something a little unusual. Carmi had an idea, and it kind of worked. We canvassed in an 8-block radius of each of the members of the Denver City Council and passed out their home phone numbers. We were told we created the biggest issue in the history of the Denver City Council. My role was simply helping to design and organize that. Local people ran it, and most of all, and I guess the real message here, is Coloradans, it was their voice. They had an opportunity for their voice to be heard, and their voice was heard.
Great. So Luana, you've got a national political campaign, you've got local green weenie obstructionists, and you've got the local water provider who has banked a generation's worth of work on building a big public works project. Is this what you signed up for as a government employee?
Absolutely, it was. I had the great advantage of having worked at EPA before in the second part of the Reagan administration. Not in the first part, not in the Burford-Gorsuch years, but in the second part when the President, Ronald Reagan, asked Bill Ruckelshaus, who was the first EPA administrator and who revered by me almost as much as I believe Riley was the best EPA administrator. But he asked Ruckelshaus to come back to EPA and fill in after Ann Burford left because Ruckelshaus represented integrity and commitment to doing the right thing. So my first stint at EPA was under Bill Ruckelshaus, And I worked for the general counsel there. I worked for the deputy administrator at EPA in those years from 83 to 86. So I'd had an opportunity to see the types of pressures and the types of issues and the types of operations that would be going on at EPA. When President Bush was running for election and said he wanted to be the environmental president, I, as a Republican and an environmentalist, was so excited and thought, this is the administration I want to be a part of. And then when I learned that Bill Riley was the administrator, I thought, this is the opportunity of a lifetime for me, and I hope for the environment, to go in and really do some things that matter and to do some things that are really good for the world. So you can imagine, after the Two Forks, Riley's initial Two Forks decision was out there, my concern was the politics. And having come in just after Burford left, I was really sensitive to the political pressures that could be brought to bear on the senior EPA leadership. So you can imagine there I am really desperately wanting to work for Bill Riley, and he asked me this question about, what do you think about my Two Forks decision? And so I had to do some real quick thinking, and that's what I was thinking when I looked out the window. Oh my gosh, do I tell him what he wants to hear, or do I tell him what I really think? And at that point in time, you know, I was a quite old 34. And so at that point in time, I decided, well, it's too late to change how I'm operating now. And that's when I said, I don't think it was a really good idea. And I thought my chances for the job were probably over. But at any rate, he liked having some people around who told him what they thought. And we started on a great relationship and a great working relationship. He then actually, shortly thereafter, had me be his lead negotiator on the Exxon Valdez oil spill. So it was a pretty interesting 4 years for me, and among many other things. But the Two Forks, for a single area, for a single issue, certainly was the most important decision I was involved in. And if you think about how government really operates, there are three basic things that come into play. And the starting point, you can start at whichever of the 3 points you want, but for me, as a lawyer and a biologist, I start with the law. Because no matter how much you might want to do something or stop something or go forward with something, if you can't do it under the law, you have no authority, and therefore you really can't act. So the Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, and that's the section this decision was permitted under initially by the Corps and was vetoed under, is probably the most convoluted, complex, illogical environmental statute that we have. Because here it gives the authority to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to issue permits. Another section of the statute says the Army Corps of Engineers must issue permits under guidelines issued by EPA. So you have one EPA saying these are the conditions under which you may issue a permit and telling another agency that. And then finally, there's another section of the statute, 404C, that says, and by the way, if EPA thinks that they don't really agree with your decision, Army Corps of Engineers, EPA can veto it. So as you can imagine, that didn't necessarily engender a lot of a warm and fuzzy feeling and collaboration initially, because there was a lot of conflict in how the Corps had been approaching things up to that time and EPA's approach to things. The second piece, obviously, is the science, the facts, what is really there, what really are the ecological issues, the ecological interests, the ecological impacts. And finally, there's the policy. And the policy is what we see and think about and hear often so much more about than we do about the facts or the law. And the policy, in my view, comes from the top. And in this case, we had a president who said he wanted to be the environmental president. But I think even more importantly, we had as EPA's administrator someone who was there not to pad his resume, not to prepare for political office, but was there to serve the public and the public interest. And that was Bill Riley. And it was a man of such great courage that he was going to protect the public interest and do the right thing at whatever personal cost might come. And that policy and that leadership that you see there is really what you have in the third piece of what I consider to be decision making. That's the part that can be influenced by the public and by reports and by politicians. But that's the piece that, while influenced by it, is not the single and sole decision maker. You have to put all these pieces of the puzzle together. So being an attorney, I saw my role clearly as being the decision that was going to be made that would be in court eventually. And so that decision had to be made in the vacuum of the administrative record. So I knew what Riley wanted to do, but to his credit, he never said, Luana, this is what you need to do. This is what I want you to do, or pressured me in any way. And quite frankly, I can say that about every single issue that we worked on. And there might have been times we would disagree, and we would have interesting conversations about those, but there weren't that many times we disagreed. Remember that safe drinking water issue at one time? But, and so as the assistant administrator, you cannot imagine being in that political world that we were operating in, the freedom and flexibility and confidence that I was given by working with Bill Riley to go out and make the right decision. As part of that decision-making process, and I had staff working on this, obviously, there was a voluminous record review, but to me, it was really important that I see what the issues really were. So in August, I came here and met with Denver Water Board, and Dave Little was there, and I wanted to tour the canyon, and I wanted to hear what they had to say. It was kind of, give me your best shot, guys. Let me hear why you think this is not an appropriate veto, why it is or isn't. We met with citizens as well. And Dave, I'm going to pass this to Dave so he can tell this piece of the story real quick.
Yeah, this is my hiking down Cheeseman Canyon story. Some of you have heard it, but I told it to Luana this morning, and she thought that was kind of fun. I took people on a lot of tours, and the EPA and other congressional people wanted to go on a tour of Cheeseman Canyon, so that was my job, take them on a tour. So we're walking down the Gill Trail, and those of you that know the Gill Trail, and I walk around the corner of the Gill Trail, and there's Cheeseman Canyon, and I paused for a moment because I was ahead of the group, and it dawned on me this simple fact. Here are a bunch of people from Washington. They're coming out of the humidity, they're coming out of the heat and all the traffic and all the stress they're dealing with. And I'm going to show them a canyon and try to convince them that this is not spectacular. And I told myself at that point, Two Forks is dead.
And I might point out my visit was in August, and so there's some validity, as you know, the DC summers. So, but that trip was just really invaluable to see the resource, to hear from citizens both in Denver and out in the communities. One little funny story is there was this great hue and cry about residential water. We have to have residential water. We have to have residential water. And so I was at one of the public meetings in one of the adjacent communities, and it was like a big multi-purpose type room, and it was semicircular and it had a glass wall all around the back. So I was facing the glass wall, and people would come up to a podium and talk about their issues. And there were a great number of people who were for the dam who were speaking. And there was a woman standing up talking about how important the dam was and how Denver residents needed the water, and a thunderstorm came up outside. So she couldn't see that. It was pouring rain outside. But then the icing on the cake was when the city's automatic lawn sprinklers came on in the middle of the thunderstorm. And I thought, maybe there really is something more they could do on water conservation out here. Maybe that's a reasonable alternative that they should look a little more closely at. So I do think, just in kind of closing, to me, this is a microcosm of government and how it can work and perhaps how it should work. But it's also a case of contrast. You have what Denver was saying, how much water was needed. And then we start this morning by looking at this growing, vibrant city that has grown in spite of the proclamations in the 1980s that Denver was going to shrivel up and die if it did not get this dam built. In terms of people's positions, when I was in Denver, we were in meetings with the project proponents, and somebody came in with a note, and the governor wanted to see me. So, I was still relatively young, and I was like, oh boy, the governor wants to see me. Okay, I don't know what that's going to be like, but I knew he was in favor of the dam, so I thought, oh, this is not going to be much fun. So I go up and I talk to him about the process and what we're doing and what we're evaluating and all the facts and what I've seen. And he listens kind of attentively and asks a couple of questions. And then it's time for me to leave, and he leans over and says, they're just a bunch of old water buffaloes anyway. Don't worry about them. And so, Paul, these are, you look at those, even Bill Miller, who was, so far out there and worked so hard at the time to get the dam built. A couple of years after that, I was at American Water Works meeting, and Bill Miller came up to me at a reception and said, you did the right thing. And so I guess for me, the takeaway is that if you try consistently to do the right thing, if you operate with integrity, if you have the type of political protection. I have very, very, very little political influence even getting to me because Riley was out there like a shield, keeping everybody away from me, giving me the opportunity to reach a decision one that he had already made. He knew it was the right thing to do, but I still had to know for the reasons in the law that it was the right thing to do. And so that really gives you the opportunity to do that. And we were really blessed to have Riley there. I think it was the golden age of EPA, and it was, I think, the golden age for the environment.
Wow. That's great. Just one question for Mr. Riley. How much of your decision about vetoing Two Forks, how much of that was about the merits of the actual project, and how much of it was about sending a political message that this president was different than his predecessor on the environment?
Well, before I got to the question of the message to be sent, I had to assure myself on some things, especially given the very strong defenses of the project I was hearing from people who mattered, from the governor. Remember Senator Bill Armstrong very angrily met with the president, and he was very unhappy. By this time I had already started it. But he looked at me at one point, he said, I won't tell you that this is the end of Denver's growth. I won't tell you you're going to shut down the city. I will tell you it's the end of Denver as a green city, as a city of green parks and trees. And I remember thinking to myself, I remember watching a TV program, and somebody was actually in Las Vegas, got arrested for watering his lawn in a very severe drought, which was forbidden. And as he was being hauled off to the police station, he said, you'd think we were living in a damn desert out here. And it occurred to me, well, you are, and it does entail certain realities. But I had to be satisfied that it was a responsible decision. And as I said, the water projections were excessive. The expectations of water use increase were hard to justify. They couldn't be justified. The population was declining at the time. Whatever you wanted to say, this magnificent resource should not have been expended at that moment. If there was going to be a time when it should be, it was not that time. And I did then feel the message was important. I remember when I went home to my wife that evening, I said, well, we'll find out now how much he wants to be the environmental president. and we did. But it was a message, and finally, that's the way I hoped it would be understood and played. I could not myself develop it that way. I didn't talk about it. It was going to be in a process that was very like, we knew it also would go to litigation. And so the fact, and it was said that Luana was just performing a charade, that I had given her secret instructions. And we were able to say, and I was able to be confident, that if and when she was deposed, as I expected she would be, she could say under oath there was not one scintilla of influence from the moment she got the authority to make that decision from me. And that is actually in the record of the judge, where he answers those charges and says there's no evidence to indicate that Riley interfered with the decision.
So did you consult beforehand with the White House or the Colorado congressional delegation or the governor?
I consulted with everybody. I didn't necessarily tell them what I was going to do. I talked to Senator Chafee, who had sworn me in front of the president. And the president, by the way, came to EPA to do that. No president had ever set foot at EPA before, to my knowledge. And there were many ways that Bush indicated 5 state dinners. My wife was always seated next to the prince or to Václav Havel, and also I was to cut in on him so he could dance with her. And I had a strong sense that he would support me, but we had no history, really. We made our history really largely with the Exxon Valdez, where I had no power or authority. I simply said I was going to go up there, and I later heard that Bush had said to Chief of Staff, that's one of the best appointments we've made. We're lucky we got him over there. So we had a great relationship. Some of the things about the project, too, that I haven't mentioned, there was a proposal as part of the project was for an 18-year permit life. Well, EPA had not been in the habit of giving 18-year permits. What did that say? That really was a clue. They did not need the water. They didn't expect to need it for some time. And there were so many of those as well. But I had to first decide it was a responsible decision to make for the city and the state. And did I tell the various political figures? Chafee had said, whatever you're going to do, if it's controversial, do it when we're out of town. And I did it on Good Friday morning.
You wanted to say something, Luana?
Oh, just in reference to the conversations and communications. When I did first start to meet with the project proponents, the attorney, Jim Sanderson's, I'd flown out, and I didn't have just wetlands. I mean, it was drinking water and wastewater and coastal and oceans issues and groundwater. I mean, I had a lot of things going on. So I'd flown out on a late night flight and get up the next morning and come to this meeting for the project proponents to tell me what their views were. And he starts the meeting off by saying, this is just a sham. This is just a pretense. The decision has already been made, which really annoyed me. I'm from Kentucky, and we don't really, we say what we mean and mean what we say. So that's the only time in my life I stood up and was ready to leave. I said, well, if it's a sham, I've got other things to do. If it's already been decided, I don't have time to sit out here. They changed their tune. But I was amused in looking back at some of the old newspaper articles, and I showed Dan this one this morning, and it was a newspaper article of my visit here in August of 1990, and Dan Lukey is quoted as saying, well, she just had to be polite and show interest in this project. So that was, I thought that there was a little more than politeness going on here at the time.
Just one quick thing to point out. I've been out of covering water issues for quite a while, but the sea change at the Denver Water Department, the Denver Water Board, since Two Forks is really remarkable. I think maybe Patty Wells is here. I thought I saw some water department people here. But over there, I mean, I think per capita water use in the metro area has actually declined since Two Forks. Can you speak to that, Dave? Or, I mean,
Well, water use has gone up, but it hasn't gone up as fast as you would anticipate with the increase in population. It's an interesting graph to look at. We've done a tremendous job at Denver Water with our conservation program and wise use of water program. Some of you may have seen the PR campaigns that we've had. They've been very creative. We've gotten national recognition from it. We are now at a point that we are working on the efficient use of water, not just serving or saving water, but making sure that when water is used, it's used efficiently. And there again, I'm saying we, I'm retired, but these fine people that still are working at Denver Water, they are working on those programs. So and it has been a sea change. It's been a sea change. You're going to hear later today in the next panel about the CRCA, and Laureline hopefully is going to say nice things about the things that went on in the CRCA, and the WISE program, which is the metropolitan entities getting together to reuse water. And then the Moffett Collection System project, which Dan Lukey in the Green Weenie and the rest of the Environmental Defense Fund suggested, and we're now in the process of trying to implement that project, and Trout Unlimited is helping us to some extent actually do that, because they supported those small project development things. So we have changed a lot, and it's great. It was great to be part of that organization.
Great. Audience questions. Got one of the great panels of Colorado water experts here. Go ahead. Feel like Oprah and walk the microphone around here.
Question for Luana Wilshire. I'm Wes Wilson. I was a member of the EPA Two Forks team. And I wonder if you heard in Washington when Lee DeHines announced his decision for the veto that he said it wasn't over until the fat lady sings.
No, I did not.
I do have a real question. Mr. Wright, I think you can see the EPA team in its analysis of water conservation really was on target. But it was woefully off of the population predictions. What do you make of that?
At the time of Two Forks, you mean?
At the time, we had very low, 0.1% growth rates. Part of the analysis of reducing demand is low.
Yeah. I don't recall focusing on that. I had represented to me the very strong pro-dam construction views of the regional administrator. I learned later that any number of people working at the regional office had bumper stickers that were slashed through the Two Forks. So there obviously was some dissonant feeling there too about it. But what I really remember at the time was I would occasionally be reminded that this was a very lonely decision. Nobody was for it. My water staff in Washington was not for it, and not for the veto, I mean. It was unthinkable, I think, in the Reagan years to interfere in a state and local government decision like that in which we had no federal money. I later, that same spring, was required to put together a hit list of water projects for Earth Day, the first Earth Day. Nixon wanted to find $500 million for school desegregation in the South. I learned that later. But I recommended the veto of any number of Corps of Engineer projects. Well, one was the Cross Florida Barge Canal, which was defeated. And, but every one of them was a federal project. They were Corps projects. I remember I had just gotten out of the Army about a year and a half before, and I asked for a briefing by the Corps of Engineers on these projects. So from my point of view, I'm this kid who doesn't know what MFS means or acre feet, and I'm writing down quickly thinking I'll go find out. And they are people who send a general and a couple of colonels and another light colonel holding the pointer. And I'm kind of staring at the stars because in my 2 years in the Army, I'd never seen a general. But anyway, those were projects that we had gone through the process of authorization, appropriation, and they would have created problems. And if you were going to really take the National Environmental Policy Act seriously, and I was the one writing the guidelines for impact assessment, you had to have a look at them. We did have a look at them. We canceled a lot of them. But the element of no federal money in the project weighed pretty heavily, certainly with the local. I came out here later to meet with the Republican leadership and a Republican group of about 40 people in a breakfast, and it was a very rough meeting. And people said I should have been working for Dukakis or for the Russians, or I mean, a lot of things were said. And I remember Don Hodel, some of you may remember Don Hodel, a protege of Secretary Watt, stood up and said, and called a halt to the name calling, and said, it's a new era, we have a new president, wants to be the environmental president. We're going to have to understand that people like Bill Riley will get appointed to office and they'll make decisions we don't like. And we've got to be respectful and recognize it's a new era. Well, I was very grateful for that. It kind of shut down the animosity, the angry comments. And so a couple of years later, I met him by chance going through Denver. Actually, Bill Ruckelshaus had told me after the veto decision I was going to go out and spend a little time with him and stay at his house. He said, but I would recommend not coming through Denver. But anyway, I thanked Hodel for that. And I said, and I particularly appreciated it because probably you didn't agree with my position. He said, I didn't agree with your decision at all. No question about that. But it was a graceful attempt to kind of ameliorate the situation. And then finally, as I was leaving, the chairman of the program, I guess of the party, whispered to me, well, nobody thought you'd really come. This, we appreciate that you did. And I tried to face the people who had different views, and I respected them.
Pass the baton. A very quick comment about the time, the frame of time. Beginning in the very late 70s, the biannual Corps of Engineers water bill had been defeated, and they could not enact it for several Congresses. And that led in 1986 to a reform bill, a package of reforms, a package of projects, different criteria, and we began to shift into that period of time where some of these policy changes were taking place. In 1989, we have the Two Forks decision. In 1992, George Miller of California and one of his staff people is here today, and Bill Bradley in the Senate put the Miller-Bradley bill together. And the Central Utah project was reformulated, the Central Valley project in California was reformulated. So you get that block of time starting in the very late 70s, but mostly in the mid-80s to the early 90s, where water policy shifted. You've been looking at it through the prism of Colorado, as understandably, it was happening nationally, and what was happening in Colorado was being reflected on a national stage. You've made the point, and Mr. Riley made the point, this was funded by bonds. This was the unusual project. It did not require federal funding, to seek federal funding. And so it was a little bit of an outlier in that whole overall process, but nevertheless controversial for all the same reasons.
And I want to add something really quickly about the funding, because to me, as I said, this is the case in which I think government worked as it should, but at the same time, it was a process where government did not work as it should. And I say that because there had been $40 million of development costs, and these are $1980. $40 million of development costs had already been spent before that decision. And that should not, that's not a good use of the public's money. So it should have been stopped sooner, is the takeaway. And so that, to me, signing it was, on the one hand, I felt good, and on the other hand, it made me really sad because it had gone that far and that much money had been spent.
This is yours? Really? Thank you. So I was just sitting there. Bill's foothills.
I just have a quick comment and then a question. Mr. Little, you may have been the one I was standing next to in the river a couple of years before the decision, fly fishing. And this person was from the Denver Water Board, and he said, someday this is all going to be underwater. And I was fairly new to Colorado, and I said, well, you got to be kidding me. But regardless of what side of the fence you're on, thank you all for your leadership. The question I have is, where do you draw the line, or what dictates where we can draw the line with, where we tell a community there's no more water left. We only have so much that we can develop. What does a community do, in your opinion? We stop issuing building permits? Are we, what happens in those situations? Is it up to the politicians or the voters? Who's it up to finally say, we can't offer you any more money to build the next set of homes?
Great. Well, you ask one of those questions that I don't think has an answer. Unless you're going to attack population growth, which is taboo, then we're going to continually have this competition for limited resources. And frankly, I have no wisdom on how we get through that. Well, you can certainly dry up farms. You can squeeze every last bit of wet out of every drop of water you have. You can dry up every stream in the river, in the environment. Everything is going to be sacrificed for growth. And I don't know how to stop that. I have no idea how to stop that.
I would just say that, first of all, 70% of water usage is agriculture in the United States and much of the rest of the world. There's a great deal of very positive research underway by Pioneer and many other companies to produce seeds that will survive in the climate that we are anticipating we'll have. There's a survey in The Economist this week about water, and the point is made that we can accommodate the population growth and the increase. Water efficiencies are there for the taking. They're in almost every system. The wastage in developing countries reaches 50% very often, largely because of failure to maintain the pipes and the systems. You can, in areas of California, people have gone over to different cultivations, different crops, when water became scarce through the drought. I would just say that the conclusion The Economist reaches is these are manageable situations when water is husbanded more carefully, used more efficiently, allocated more intelligently. I remember some years ago in Arizona when, in Tucson, I believe, maybe it was, I'm not sure, when in order to build any big water-consuming industrial facility, you had to prove that there was 100 years of available water to support it. And if you couldn't do that, you had to go somewhere where that was possible. So I think there are a lot of alternatives that one has in water usage. We have a very high per capita rate of water usage in the United States. It's only recently that in Los Angeles, people began to reuse wastewater. I remember when I was the Council on Environmental Quality, we took the president to a nutrient-reducing tertiary treatment plant. And he walked through it, and he saw all of the putrid waste going in, and then at the end of it, the manager put a glass up and gave him the glass, and he went white. And, and then he developed a sly smile, and he turned to his press guy, and he gave it to him. and as the press moved on, and the reporters did not hear, but some of the staff heard, press guy said, well, I guess I'm not the first PR guy to take shit for his boss. But anyway, there are a lot of things you can do, in short, and that is where I would start. Yeah.
For the past 19 years, I've worked for a water district in Southern California, Inland Empire. It's the easternmost water district in the metropolitan family. And since 2000, we've had a program to recycle water. And we've been among the leaders in pushing and promoting the recycled water program. I was deeply involved in the creation of Title 16 legislatively back in 1992. But it had its origins with Manuel Lujan in 1991 in the Bush administration. That's where it came from. And today, Inland Empire is in a long-term effort to put 100,000 acre-feet of recycled water online. So the capacity for using water far more efficiently and far more smarter is very real, and this buys us decades in terms of addressing these water challenges.
Well, go ahead.
I'll start with my question. My question is, what advice would you give we Coloradans about what we can do going forward dealing with our water issues? I'm from northern Colorado currently. I moved back to Colorado as soon as I could 14 years ago. I lived in Colorado Springs in the mid-1980s, learned to fly fishing in Cheeseman Canyon at Deckers. Was taught by some local residents that were quite helpful to me. I went on to live in the Sonoran Desert, upstate New York, all over the country, raising my family, moving around. But when I came back to northern Colorado and got involved with water issues, I had to learn a lot. Took a long time. Feel like we're in the midst of some really interesting water issues right now, in northern Colorado especially. So looking at that, what would you advise us going forward, what we might do in the present era, based on your prior experience?
Yeah, how about from Dan?
There's an economist at CSU, now retired, Bob Young, and he made the distinction between what he called expansionary phases of water economies and mature phases of water economies. An expansionary phase is when there are a lot of options, when there are decreasing marginal costs, and very few links among systems. Mature phase flips all of those things over so that there are increasing marginal costs, few options for new development, but linkages in systems. And in Colorado, we're clearly well into a mature phase, but we do not take advantage of some of those linkages are there, and we do not pay attention to the increasing marginal costs that we face. Solving that problem, getting into that phase in a management fashion, involves, in a way, reinventing government. And by that I mean, if we take a look, it's not that water economies establish the way we organize ourselves for government, but we have counties and cities and special districts and so on and so forth. We've got to think beyond those lines, if you will, and figure out how to work on a larger scale. And the South Platte system is already plumbed, if you will, to do that. But governmentally and institutionally, we're not at that point yet. But I think we are beginning to see that it's essential that we get there, and that we have a management system that is up to the times, up to the challenges. I think in the Denver metro area that is happening to some extent, but it's got to extend to the entire basin, and it's got to involve all users, not just municipal users, but the agricultural community as well.
And I'd also add that one of the things I've learned over my career is that unless people are willing to sit down and check their biases at the front door and think about how you can address these very, very difficult, challenging problems collectively and cooperatively, it won't get done. And that's a critical thing that needs to happen. You want a good model of that. Lurleen, I think, is going to probably talk about it, maybe Jim Lockhead, about the CRCA, how traditional enemies came together and crafted something, frankly, that's quite beautiful. And I think that's what it's going to take to get through these very difficult times as more and more people and more values are competing for the water resources that are available.
I'll just say as a reporter, you know, it's one thing to talk about the Denver Water Board, the Denver Water Department, the Grant County Commission, but the reality is that these institutions are us. You know, it doesn't have to be this fight where people have these predestined positions. Institutions answer to constituents.
And if we all do a better job, I think, of listening to each other, you can head off train wrecks. $40 million spent on a project that doesn't proceed. And I hope that a big lesson from Two Forks is that we can realize that people have different takes on things, and sometimes you learn some of your best ideas from the people who aren't your natural allies. So.
I just want to acknowledge some people who are here in this front row: Bob Weaver, Ben Harding, Lee Rosakis, Robert Wigington, from the environmental community who worked on this. We started our model on Ben's desktop computer, a Commodore or something like that. But also, a person who's not here, an economist who used to work with us, John Morris was his name, and he kind of kept us on track on the economics of these issues. And when all was said and done, and we were celebrating what we thought we had accomplished, and that it was all our doing, and you were kind of following our lead there in Washington. I was talking with John one time. He said, you guys think you're so smart. He says, you got struck by lightning. Enjoy it. It may never happen again.
Thanks a million. One more? Oh, okay. Go for it.
Just a question for everybody on the panel. If you were in the same job today that you were in 30 years ago, how would your job have been harder, easier, from the politics, the lobbying, all the things that you had to deal with?
It's unthinkable. Unthinkable I would ever be asked to do that by this president. Unthinkable that I would agree to if I were. I look at some of the decisions, the methane decision, which I know from having been on the board of an oil company, the oil industry had already responded to, put the capital aside, captured the wastage and leakage, and now it's being revisited. The mercury rule, I was on the board of a utility, a big Texas utility that when I was in private equity we acquired, and I know that several hundred millions of dollars had been spent to accommodate and comply with the mercury rule. That's being opened up again and reconsidered. So there are things I don't understand that are happening now and that I do regret. But there we are. I do tend to believe that there are cycles of, I thought to myself, and I said this at the time, that the period of the Reagan administration was one after, for the first 2 years, of battening down, reorganizing, consolidating. It was reacting. And that my period coincided with an opportunity to do something very different. It was our moment. It was a moment to innovate. It was a moment when the president smiled on our agency. I remember a young black assistant going up in the elevator with me one day, and she said, I think the president likes us. And you know, you look back at several of the presidents, Carter, Reagan, Ford to some degree, had campaigned against the bureaucracy, against Washington, against the government they would lead. Bush had not done that. Bush respected them. He knew from many years that they deserved that respect. Those moments will come again. I'm often asked what my advice is to senior people at EPA now. It's very much stay the course if you can. I think the man who is now leading EPA has integrity. He worked for 4 years for us at EPA. I don't think that he will be allowed to do a lot of the things that we would like him to do, and I'm not sure that he is inclined to anyway. It's a different outlook. But the people who stayed through the difficult years of the Reagan year, I enjoyed their resources, their intelligence, their experience, and I hope that the agency sticks together. One thing the Republican Congress has not been credited for that it should have been, they have not acted on the proposals to strip EPA of all of its top talent. There's a lot of that that's been lost, but nothing like a third of the staff has been let go, or a third of the budget has been cut. That's encouraging, because had those things happened, I think it would be a lot more difficult to reconstruct the agency when that moment comes again, and it will.
Okay, would any other panelists like to comment on that question?
I'd go back if Riley was administrator, but that's.
Okay, well, I think I can speak on behalf of everyone in this room in saying that we're extremely grateful to each of you for spending your time with us this morning and opening up about your experiences and the stories from that period to help us understand the Two Forks veto. So please join me in thanking our panelists. I have the distinct pleasure of working with on a daily basis, and that's Jared Smith, who's on my team at Water Education Colorado. She is the editor for our Freshwater News initiative, which we launched last June. And we are producing a weekly news report with original reporting by Jared herself. She was formerly with the Rocky Mountain News when I first met her before they shuttered their doors in 2009. And she's worked with a wide variety of outlets in the years since. So, Jared, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce the rest of our panel to panelists.
Hi, everybody. Hey, I just, no pun intended, but I had to get them some water. Yeah. So it's great to be here today. Great to see. I'm always stunned at how many people care about water in this state. It doesn't matter if you're in San Luis or Sterling or Denver. There are always so many people who are ready to be out here and to be passionate about this issue. Yeah, and so I'm, as Jayla just said, I'm editor of Freshwater News. It's a startup that Water Education sought to launch last year in an effort to make up for some of the holes that have developed and gaps in coverage in the news business. That means that there just isn't enough water news being written. So they brought me on, and it was nice to be back. I covered water for the Rocky Mountain News for a long time. And I started covering water in '02, in the drought of '02. And I did so at the behest of our executive editor, who said, we've got to get somebody on this. They asked me to come over from the business desk and start covering water. And unfortunately, he was the only person in our newsroom who thought it was important. And as you guys probably don't know, although I know my friends, colleagues who've been in newsrooms, they are not necessarily nice places. They're often harsh. It's a very acquired taste to work in a room with 200 people, all of whom have ADD. And one of my favorite signs in a newsroom was when, in an editor's desk, there was a sign that said, state your business, walk away, nobody gets hurt. So it was very much like that. But anyway, so I started covering water during the drought, and it was an unprecedented time for Denver Water, for Castle Rock, for Parker. It was an unprecedented time. It was almost, probably the largest drought that hit in a highly urban time, when Colorado had become so much more urban than it had ever been before, when droughts were hitting, like in 1977 or in the Dust Bowl. I mean, they were all terrifying, but I'm not sure we'd had a drought prior to '02 where there were so many people to be terrified at the same time. So that marked a big change. With that said, this morning you guys have at your disposal a fabulous group of water luminaries up on this stage. Far to my right is Lisa Darling. She runs the South Metro Water Authority, which serves some of the fastest growing parts of Colorado. Next to her is Lurleen Curran, who is former manager of Grand County. She has played a major role in water on the West Slope, and during the past 15 years came in to play a major role in an important agreement we call the Colorado River Cooperative. Next to her is Jim Lockhead. He's CEO of Denver Water. And then we have Doug Benevento, who is administrator for Region 8 of the EPA. And last but certainly not least, Dave Nickum, who is executive director of Colorado Trout Unlimited. So with our introductions, this will very much be a conversation. And as we spent the last couple of hours listening to that fascinating history about Two Forks and all of the work, the millions of dollars, the fish, everything that happened around then, now we're going to fast forward, you know, nearly 20 years later, more than that, to look at where we are, what happened right then, what it triggered, what happened in the 1990s and the early 2000s, and equally important and very, very important, where we are now and where we're going to go. So with that, I will count on our great panelists to give us their thoughts on a number of things. The first thing we wanted to chat about is when the veto actually happened, it was, I think, to a huge number of people, shocking. It was definitely unexpected. And we would like you guys to tell our audience sort of what it was like for each of you. I know many of you are no longer in the roles that you were in back then, but just sort of reach back into your memory banks and tell us what it looked like. So, Lisa, let's start with you.
Is this on? Good morning. So it's hard when you look back and you realize that when all of this happened, we have people who are joining us in our industry today that weren't born when this happened, right? So when you look around the room and you realize how old we all really have become, it was a long, long time ago, right? The first panel was just fabulous to listen to. Such a respected group. Things that Dave Little said actually really resonated with me, so thanks, Dave, about how the veto really was more of a delayed flight. You know, it's kind of was a moment in time. You know, Colorado water is full of risk, and there's a number of us who have gone and done a number of projects that haven't come to fruition for a number of reasons. Was this one a very long, protracted, expensive process? Of course. But there have been a number of other ones that some of us can talk about, Doug, SP Cup, Collegiate Peaks. You know, that's part of our business, I think, is to reassess and constantly be moving forward. But of course, after the veto, you know, a number of things happened. A lot of the sort of non-Denver participants, I think, continued to meet to discuss planning roles. And at that time, Tom Griswold, the late Tom Griswold, who was the director of Aurora at the time, which was, you know, where I started in my career in Colorado, really, he was really leading that effort to prevent the stake from kind of being driven through the heart of Two Forks. Because what really happened was then it was followed by the wild and scenic designation, which ended up becoming, a lot of the folks who were involved in the Two Forks process ended up being very involved in that as well. And of course, that ended up with a local alternative, which was, and ended up with the South Platte Enhancement Board. And Dave can talk a lot about that, I'm sure. But so there were a number of different processes that happened. And then also what was followed was the Metropolitan Water Supply investigation in the early 90s, which really, I thought it was, really struck me when Administrator Riley said, you know, there wasn't a crisis. There just wasn't a crisis. And I had to reflect, you know, I think that if we always looked at projects and said, well, you have to be in crisis before you could actually move forward on a project. When you look at a number of the projects we work on, that's an interesting concept. But the Metropolitan Water Supply investigation really indicated that there was a need, particularly in the South Metro region, where growth was just unprecedented and the groundwater levels were just declining. And there was really no plan in place. And of course, that really led to the Chatfield reallocation becoming a reality, which was one of the alternatives that was listed for Two Forks. You know, $171 million construction, and now it's finally getting started. So just a little bit of a reflection on a timeline. But that's that's sort of where we started down many of the paths that we are on now.
Good morning. I am from Grand County. I was raised in Grand County. I've raised my kids there, and now my grandkids are being raised there. So I'm Grand County to the core. When I went to work for the county, I worked for the county 33 years. The first day of my employment, I was taken to the then county manager's office, and there was a big sign that said, "Damn Denver Water." And it wasn't DAM. So that was our opinion of Denver Water. They were the big dogs on the block. We had been run over many times. We didn't quite know how to play in their playground. And we are the most impacted county in the state for Trans Mountain diversions. So we knew what it was like to deal with Denver Water. And when I say deal, there was no deal. We didn't talk, we didn't negotiate. We just had to accept the consequences of Denver Water's decisions. When I was thinking about Two Forks and the veto, I'm big on analogies, and I got to thinking about when you're playing in a softball game, and you're playing against an opponent that's whooped you every time you've come up against them, and you're close. You're close to winning, but you're not sure, and you're the one up to bat, and you've struck out every time you're up there. And your team is counting on you, and you know there's not a snowball's chance that you're going to hit this ball. And all of a sudden, out of the blue, you connect, and you have a home run. And for us, the veto, it was a victory. We didn't really realize that it had to go on through a process and whatever. It was a veto, and it meant stop to us. So we were thrilled. We weren't quite sure what was going to happen next. We were pretty sure Denver wasn't going to take this lying down, but we weren't sure what the next step was going to be, and we certainly never envisioned the Colorado River Cooperative Agreement or our future negotiations and interactions with Denver, what could happen when people decide to sit down and try to work through issues rather than be dictated to. We never realized that that was going to be an outcome of the veto of Two Forks. And it was an opportunity, and we are most glad that Denver took that as an opportunity to look at the future and say, well, what can we do differently? And I am 100% in support of the Colorado River Cooperative Agreement. Of course, I dedicated a great many years of my life to it, but it was an agreement, and it is an agreement that we don't even know yet what that agreement is going to do for us. When it is fully implemented and we really put those processes in place, we are going to see how water in Colorado can be managed and should be managed in the future, and we have the veto of Two Forks to thank for that.
Well, Dave Little described the Two Forks veto as an inflection point for Denver Water, and I want to talk about it from a little bit of a personal perspective because my history kind of weaves back and forth with Denver Water. I grew up in Southern California, came here to college, and was this young environmentalist who heard about this thing called the Foothills proposal. And there was this opportunity to testify in opposition to the Foothills proposal on the EIS. And so I showed up at the hearing, and I think it was at one of the local high schools, Inglewood High School or something. And up on the stage was a group of, I think, 5 or so men who were there to listen to quote unquote public input on the Foothills project. And auditorium was filled with people. And one of the men looks down and looks at the list of people signed up to testify. And the first person we want to hear from is Jim Lockhead. And that was really a terrifying moment for me. I can't remember what I said, but I testified against the Foothills project. And then after law school, I went to Glenwood Springs to practice law. And so I was on Lurlene's side of the hill. And we really saw, the way I describe the approach to water supply development in the West, and certainly Denver Water's approach to to water supply development was monolithic and linear. It was monolithic in that whatever got in Denver Water's way was an obstacle that was simply going to be run over. And it was linear in terms of the projections that were made. It was an assumption that the future was going to look like the past. You simply project out hydrology, you project out population, there's a gap, and you go find water. Simple as that. And that was the way things were done. And I think putting Two Forks in context, you also need to think about the scope and the breadth of the plans that Denver Water had for the development of a water supply for the Denver metropolitan area. So it wasn't just Two Forks. It was the Eagle Colorado project, which involved a huge reservoir at Walcott, diverting water from the Eagle River, from the Colorado River to Walcott, moving it through the wilderness area over into the Blue River system, the Eagle Piney project, to an enlarged Two Forks reservoir, reaching halfway across from the Continental Divide to Grand Junction to pull water to the Denver metropolitan area. And as well as the water supply development, the litigation that ensued, that I, as a young lawyer, had the pleasure to be representing the Colorado River District in opposition to Denver, of things like Denver withholding water in Dillon Reservoir from Green Mountain Reservoir in the 1977 drought, and filings that Denver Water just boldly made on Green Mountain Reservoir. And if you're from Western Colorado, Green Mountain Reservoir is Western Colorado's reservoir, and damn it, if the Denver Water Board is going to file on the Green Mountain Reservoir, that's a declaration of war. And in some of that litigation, it was obvious, and Denver viewed itself as the water provider for the entire Denver metropolitan area. That was the manifest destiny. That was what they were after. And from a Western Slope standpoint, what you view that as is a juggernaut. It was the possibility of a vast metropolitan water district. We looked at the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California and thought, well, that's what it's going to be. And so with the Two Forks veto, the backdrop of that is really complicated in terms of the relationships between Denver and the suburbs. It goes back to the Poundstone Amendment. It goes back to desegregation. It goes back to a complex cost relationship of the payment of that system. And so when word came down in 1989 that the veto process was going to start, what the Denver Water Board did was immediately begin to create the crisis. They announced that we're going to annually look at tap allocations. The water may not be there for the suburbs anymore. This is going to be really bad. This area is going to be short of water. And then after the veto, I would describe it as a gigantic and massive hangover. It was all of a sudden Denver Water Board woke up, kind of shook their heads, and what do we do now? And so they issued a document and a doctrine called the New Path Forward. And that New Path Forward was authored by Hubert Farbs, who was on the board at the time, described that background of the Poundstone Amendment, that there are no more reservoir sites left, that social change and social values have evolved, that there are all these environmental laws that all of a sudden we woke up and found out all of a sudden they apply to us. And so Denver Water is no longer going to be the water provider for the Denver metropolitan area. We will cooperate, we will work with everybody, but that role is done and gone. So that was the inflection point. In 1996, the Denver Water Board, in the wake of the first integrated resource plan, issued a resource policy statement that kind of expanded on that and basically said, we're going to take care of our own in terms of our own combined service area, and we're happy to work with other entities, but there better be something in it for Denver Water in doing so. So it was very much of a bit of a retrenchment from that old point. And I think we'll talk, I think, a little bit about some of what's happened since then. But I think to the credit of Denver Water, we found our sea legs again. We followed the green weenie. And then moved forward quite proactively and in a much different way that I'll talk about in a little bit in terms of going into the future.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you. First, I just want to recognize Administrator Riley. It was very, very great, really an opportunity to hear him speak, and it was wonderful. I was telling my boss, Administrator Wheeler, worked for him at the EPA and recalled fondly those years. I was just back in D.C. and outside of the administrator's office, there are portraits, paintings of all the previous administrators. So as you're walking down the hall to go to the administrator's office, all of the former administrator portraits are looking down on you, and your portrait's there, administrator, and that's the one where the eyes seem to follow you as you're walking by it. So I just want you to know, your presence is felt. I do, pardon me, I didn't turn my phone off. I apologize. Excuse me. The question was, where were we at when the veto on Two Forks occurred, and what was the reaction? And I was at the time, I was just out of college, and I was working on a congressional campaign for then State Senator Wayne Allard. And the veto came right after the election. And I could tell you what our reaction was at the time, because Allard had just won the 4th Congressional District, which at that time encompassed Larimer County, Weld, and then basically the plains, everything basically east of Denver. And our initial reaction was concern about agriculture, concern about what this meant for the future of agriculture in Colorado. The issue from our point of view was, were our constituents going to be selling their water? Was agriculture going to dry up? What did this mean? And frankly, our reaction was, okay, what do we do? What can we do to try and reverse the decision? What can we do to try and protect agriculture and to protect our constituents? I think Congressman Allard and Administrator Riley may have met at somewhere around that point, but I would just characterize ourselves as being very concerned. And we spent a lot of time talking to Jim's predecessor, Chip Sperry, about what their plans were and what were they going to do, moving forward, assuming they couldn't win an appeal, either a political appeal or a judicial appeal. So that was where we were at the time. My perspective is a little bit more political, because that was the role I was in at the time, and in terms of the fellow I worked for. So I'll turn it over to Dave.
Thank you. So I'm in a somewhat different position in that I was not in Colorado and not following Two Forks at the time of the veto itself. So my first impressions came shortly in the aftermath. I moved here working for National Trout Unlimited in 1995. And I can say, looking at folks at that time that I was working with in the environmental community and the members of Trout Unlimited, there was still a sense of jubilation, of pride, of, wow, we did this, and probably not enough of that humility that Dan was talking about. You sort of got struck by lightning, guys, you got lucky. But it had, as I came here, I would almost say it had become part of the kinds of stories the environmental community tells about itself, the mythologies we all make about ourselves, or our institutions or organizations, to help give us motivation, a sense of identity, and the sense that the environmental community looked at it and said, we were able to band together, be thoughtful, come up with some alternatives, and fight this fight, and ultimately see this project stopped, was something that there was a tremendous amount of pride in. At that time that I first arrived, we were starting to transition into the next step, which was looking at the Wild and Scenic study, which was reopened by the Forest Service once the decision had settled with the dam project itself. The river had been seen earlier as eligible for Wild and Scenic, but they had set that aside while there was this looming threat of a dam that would actually inundate the entire project. They felt like, let's wait to look at Wild and Scenic. And at that point, it was very interesting because there was, while there was a sense of jubilation, there was also this lingering fear of, is this going to come back? You know, is it gone for good? How do we, you know, what is the risk, and can we possibly get wild and scenic protection to make it a permanent level of protection? And at the same time, I think there was a recognition that that would be an incredibly heavy lift. Even if the federal agency were willing to find the river suitable to get a wild and scenic designation, you need congressional action. And the prospects for that were dim. Conversely, though, I do think some of our colleagues on the water supply side and some of the local governments looked at suitability as posing risks of its own to some of their operations. And so it was an interesting dynamic where there was some mistrust and fear on both sides, I think, of the water communities there. But out of that, we were able to start what became, over a lot of hard years, some very fruitful conversations, and led to a alternative for the South Platte Wild and Scenic that has been doing, in my view, great work for the last almost 15 years in terms of helping manage stream flows, water temperatures in a more advantageous way. And notably, Denver, to sort of alleviate some of those fears, agreeing to put a moratorium on any efforts to try to further develop the Two Forks site. And during that time, it sort of set the stage, saying the structure of the agreement was such that Denver was putting a moratorium on and dangling the potential of abandoning all potential future, including the underlying right-of-way that they held for the smaller version of Two Forks from the Forest Service, if they were able to successfully develop alternatives, if they were able to follow some of the ideas that had been presented by the environmental community. And they are still working on some of those right now, and we'll probably be talking a little bit more about those later.
So after Two Forks, there was an emphasis there, I think, certainly an emphasis that Colorado had to do better, and the metro area had to do better in terms of conservation, reuse, and recycling. But it would take years, it seems to me, before we began to see substantive work on that. And then '02 hit, and there was this sort of giant uh-oh. And in my view, feel free to correct me, Lisa. Lisa spent a lot of time at Aurora Water before she went to South Metro. But of the communities in the metro area in '02, Aurora was definitely the young kid on the block. It had a really young portfolio of water rights. It had a rapidly growing population. It was in deep trouble. It saw its supplies in '02. I mean, Denver was in bad shape, but Aurora was in much worse shape. And as I watched Aurora back then, it always seemed to me that really Aurora was the Las Vegas of the metro area. They were always criticized for growing too much, for needing all this water, but in fact, they were able to be incredibly innovative. And one of the projects that Aurora was able to get in place, called Prairie Waters, was really one of there had been some recycling in the metro area and in Colorado Springs before then, but Prairie Waters was definitely the biggest effort. It was in credit at the time, it was probably one of the only ones in the country. It was one of several new initiatives that would be triggered by the stuff that began with Two Forks, and it wasn't the only one, of course. We now have WISE, which is a infrastructure sharing program that allows many metro areas, with the cooperation of Denver and Aurora, to share recycled water. And then equally important in that time, another really innovative initiative was called the Colorado River Cooperative Agreement. So I'd like Lisa and Lurleen and Jim, we'll start with Lisa, to respond to these new initiatives, how they got, how they're doing, where they're going, and why they're important to where we are right now. So Lisa, tell us a little bit about Prairie Waters.
When you look back at 2002, it was just some bad times at work. It was rough. I think, depending on how you interpreted the data, Aurora was down to about 26% in storage, about 1 year's worth of water. And had we had a repeat of the '02, '03, and if that had continued, it would have been severe. And conservation really, that is really the introduction of a tremendous program that Aurora has now of conservation demand management. But what happened was, when we realized, and you look back on it, you're watching the water levels fall, we still look back and kind of think, what exactly happened? And I don't know if we can all put our finger exactly on it, but what happened was we did this very short, intense, integrated resource plan with Doug Kemper at the helm back then, and then Peter Binney joining us. We looked at all of the basins, and of course Aurora is fairly young, but has water rights in 3 basins, and so we looked at all basins, all sizes. It had to be fast, it had to be environmentally sensitive, but we just had to get it on the ground, and that ended up being the Prairie Waters Project. As Gerd said, it's a recycled program that brings water back from the Brighton area using an alluvial well field, 32-mile pipeline to bring the water home and to reuse it. And it was incredibly innovative, and it was a really exciting thing to be a part of. But then, of course, we all recall what happened in 2003, I think on St. Patrick's Day. We got 5 feet of snow. And that ended up being the recovery point, I think, where many of us started turning around, and Aurora realized, that they were probably going to be on that back end of that because they were junior, and so to recover those reservoirs and to recover the system was going to take a little bit more time. Those conversations in those early aughts started setting the foundation really for WISE, which is a water infrastructure and supply efficiency partnership. The South Metro communities, of course, had continued to develop and grow, many on the non-tributary groundwater, which was obviously problematic and had been pointed out in a number of studies. The South Metro Water Supply Authority was actually formed in 2004 for the purpose of forming a partnership using shared investment and efficiencies to try to start moving off of that non-renewable resource to something more renewable. And coincidentally, Aurora had a very large project that they needed some help paying for. So at that time, the door opened to those conversations. And then Denver had also realized that they wanted an opportunity to start recapturing some of their Platte supplies, perhaps as a backup to some of their Colorado water rights. And so the partnership came together. It's really unique in that it was an opportunity. It didn't involve water court. This was something that was advantageous to all 3 parties. Everyone hung on to their own assets. And it wasn't what many people feared was this development of the regional water authority concept. Everybody sort of kept their toys, but shared them a little bit better. So those are 2 things that happened after the veto, but really after the drought, that I think really kind of spurred a lot of that. And then, of course, we also have a very small role in the CRCA. So I'll let Jim and Lurleen talk about that.
So I mentioned the kind of where Denver Water was post veto, and kind of part of the process of getting our sea legs back and kind of getting back in the game involved some outreach to the West Slope, and really pretty much immediately, starting in about 1992. Chips Berry, Dave Little, Patty Wells, a number of other people at Denver Water began this process of we got to figure out a different way of doing business and a different path. So discussions with the West Slope and Summit County around a Summit County agreement to preserve lake levels at Dillon, provide some water supply for snowmaking, and doing some other things with Summit County. An agreement with the Colorado River District to participate in the construction of Wolford Mountain Reservoir and use that water by exchange. It's not that these negotiations were easy, and Lurleen can talk about that, because the mistrust between West Slope and Denver, and frankly Denver and Northern, it was just a question of which of those 3 entities was going to be the bad guy of the day. But it did create this atmosphere of being able to talk. And Denver was going down the path of the Green Weenie. Water use today in the Denver service area is about what it was in the 1970s, despite about 250,000 more people in our service area. We have a recycled treatment plant, and as part of the CRCA, we're on target to reuse 30,000 acre feet of water under that recycled treatment plant. And in 2002, what happened in the wake of the Hayman Fire and the Buffalo Mountain Fire, Buffalo Creek Fire, was the fact that we realized that 80% of our water supply comes from the south end of our system, and that was incredibly vulnerable to catastrophic wildfire and other events that could potentially completely disrupt the water supply for the Denver metropolitan area. A hugely impactful event. Together with the drought of 2002, in which we nearly ran out of water at the north end of our system because of the lack of storage at the north end of our system and the lack of system flexibility. And so Denver Water decided to move down the path of going for the permitting for an enlarged gross reservoir. We're still there in that permitting process. But part of that involved, and I think credit goes a lot to the board of the Denver Water Board, of pushing staff toward, you know, the old way really didn't work. There's got to be a different way. There's got to be a better way. And you need to go having some conversations about doing this the right way. And that led to 6 years of negotiation with not just Grand County, and Lurleen can talk about the West Slope perspective of kind of how the whole coalition came about, but 40 different entities all the way from the Continental Divide to Grand Junction, where Denver Water agreed, we're not just going to deal with mitigation of this enlargement and what it means for additional diversions out of the Fraser River, but we're going to talk about all the impacts of our operations. It coincided with some litigation on the Blue River, and so it involved Summit County and, again, Dillon Reservoir and the Blue River Decree and the interrelationships between Dillon Reservoir and Green Mountain Reservoir. And it involved the impacts in the Fraser River Basin and water quality impacts all the way down, as I mentioned, to Grand Junction. And so out of that negotiation, which was driven by these issues, but also driven by the process by which board members and staff over a period of 6 years would argue and negotiate and disagree and come back and agree, and then the agreement would fall apart. But it was built on those personal relationships and finally a degree of mutual trust around a concept, in particular in Grand County, of a realization that with the system flexibility of an enlarged gross reservoir, Denver Water would be able to have greater capacity to be able to meet environmental needs in Grand County. And I think from Denver Water's perspective, it was a reflection of what the environmental group did on Two Forks. Grand County came up with a stream management plan that created a credible body of evidence of impacts to the system. The other kind of, to me, breakthrough was the realization among the parties that, you know, Denver Water disagreed with certain aspects of that stream management plan, but we could argue for decades. We could do modeling, we could disagree, and the aquatic environment in Grand County would suffer on a daily basis as we sat around and disagreed about modeling. And so what we agreed to was, first of all, that Grand County could actually be better off with this project than without this project. And secondly, we agreed, let's get to work. Let's go on the ground and let's forget about the models. Let's look at the aquatic systems and let's set up a process by which we can operate daily, monthly, with the environment as it exists in Grand County, and figure out how to use Denver Water's system flexibility while not impacting the yield to our customers, to be able to provide water to the environment when and where it's needed. And that's where the concept of learning by doing, that's embedded in the Colorado River Cooperative Agreement, is, I think, a historic, you talk about an inflection point, an historic approach to responsible water supply development. Denver Water is not your typical project proponent who comes in, builds the project, does their mitigation, and then walks away. What the CRCA does, what Learning by Doing does, is it joins us at the hip with Grand County, with Trout Unlimited, with federal and state agencies in managing the Fraser River and our operations in perpetuity for the benefit of both our customers and for the aquatic environment in Grand County. The other thing that we've done is that the CRCA has certain benchmarks of requirements for Denver Water to put up money or to supply water or to do certain obligations as the project moves forward, whether it's the final permit, whether it's the initiation of construction, those kinds of things. We've already begun to voluntarily initiate Learning by Doing and some of the activities under that Colorado River Cooperative Agreement, simply because it's the right thing to do. And we obviously hope that we're going to be able to complete all of those with the completion of the enlargement of Gross Reservoir. But it's important for us to solidify our commitment and a partnership with Grand County, with the West Slope, and ultimately with Boulder County on the construction impacts associated with the construction of the enlarged Gross Reservoir. And I would mention on this side of the divide, Gross Reservoir, with climate change and a number of other things, provides important flood control operations, even though we don't operate it for flood control purposes. In 2013, it served that purpose. It did in the 1960s as well with some flooding. There's an environmental pool in there, in the reservoir that we've dedicated, that we've given to City of Boulder, City of Lafayette to be able to manage their water rights down South Boulder Creek for aquatic health. And as a result, in the 401 certification for the project, the Colorado Department of Health and Environment found that the project provides a net environmental benefit to Colorado. So from Denver Water's perspective, that inflection point, those negotiations leading up to the CRCA, in a whole new way of doing business of, we have to be responsible not just to our customers, but to the communities we impact in the environment. And from my perspective, coming from the West Slope and going against Denver Water, and it speaks a lot, I think, of the Denver Water Board that they would hire somebody from the West Slope, who's a former adversary of Denver Water, former director of Department of Natural Resources. I think it sends a major signal as well as to the ethic that Denver Water now brings into our operations and the way we develop and supply water.
Jim has covered quite a bit of it, but I'll give you a little bit of Grand County's perspective. Not only was Denver proposing their gross enlargement, but at the same time, Northern was proposing their Windy Gap firming project. So we were sitting in the middle of what I call a perfect storm. It was kind of like getting hit by lightning. Everybody wanted to know, well, what do you want, Grand County? Because we were going to be the eye of the hurricane for these two projects. Well, if you ask anybody in Grand County, we all had our subjective opinions of what we wanted, but instead, we stepped back, 14,000 people, and we spent over $1 million of our own taxpayer money with no influence from Denver, no influence from Northern, and we created a stream management plan. So from an environmental and scientific position, we knew what we needed, and that turned into what we wanted. And we could then bargain and negotiate from a position of knowing what was necessary for our environment. And please understand, in Grand County, Denver takes their water out at the very headwaters at the Continental Divide. The Colorado Big Thompson project, which serves Northern, takes it out at the headwaters of the Colorado River. The mitigation reservoir for Denver Water is Williams Fork Reservoir, which is in the middle of the county. The mitigation reservoir for Colorado Big Thompson is Green Mountain, which is pretty much in Summit and Grand County, in a bit of Grand County. So all of the mitigation reservoirs, the water's taken out here and the water's put back in here. And we have a big hole in the river, and it's just gotten worse over time. So when Denver asked us what we wanted, we laid out the stream management plan, and we decided as a West Slope, we needed to come together as a group and negotiate with Denver from Grand County clear down to Grand Junction. But first we had to decide between ourselves how we could work together, because there were certain wants and needs up and down the river that didn't complement other wants and needs on the river. So first of all, we had to come together and decide how we could negotiate and work as a team, a West Slope team. The River District was critical in that. They represent a good portion of the West Slope, but their board decided to put a great deal of their focus in the headwaters counties, in Grand County, Summit County, Eagle County, and that's where they spend a majority of their staff time and their budget for the next 6 to 8 years in making sure that the whole West Slope was represented appropriately, but those most impacted counties were really given a majority of their time and their energy. Then we started negotiation. And when we started negotiating, I think the only thing we ever agreed on was lunch. The West Slope would sit on one side of the table, Denver would sit on the other side of the table, and we would just kind of have a stare down for a while, and we would have a few points that we could talk about, but we'd just go away. But we weren't friends, and we didn't ever think we were going to be friends, or it was necessary for us to be friends. But over time, that big guy back there in the corner, he has a way of making you feel like, well, maybe you are listened to, and maybe you could talk to him, and maybe he would sit over on the west side of the table, and maybe one of us would go over on the east side. So slowly but surely, just like was said this morning, we all came to the real realization that we each had a job to do, and it was for the entity that we worked for, but it didn't have to be personal. And once we started that kind of perspective, we were able to move forward with a number of very thorny issues that we think we had settled and then we didn't. We would walk away saying, well, we'll talk about this, and we would always come back, maybe not with the solution that we each thought, but a solution that we could all live with. The Colorado River Cooperative Agreement, the Board of County Commissioners that I worked for said, we will not enter into any agreement that doesn't make us better when it's done than we are today. And please know, the Colorado River, at least where I live, is on a tipping point environmentally. The Fraser River has been designated as one of the most impacted rivers in the United States. So we needed to do something. There's been a lot of talk about, well, how can you possibly negotiate something where you give up more water and you're already in dire straits? Well, that was the purpose. It was like some people didn't realize, well, we knew that going in. What were we going to do about it? So the Colorado River Cooperative Agreement is extremely important. It's extremely complicated. It is a benchmark that I don't think had ever been reached before, and it will be a perspective that is used in the future on how you work and use a limited resource that is going to get more limited over time. Grand County ended up hiring an environmental attorney and a water attorney that grew up in Grand County, Mr. Tosick, and his family had had many interactions with Denver Water. And we proceeded along with our little group, marching along, and we felt like David against Goliath, but we had the River District behind us. So there's some very monumental things in the Colorado Cooperative Agreement. Learning by doing is a monumental effort. It has been started before it was ever envisioned it would be started. And the first project of learning by doing is on the Fraser River, a little over a mile of river, public-private partnership. Colorado Parks and Wildlife had shocked this part of the river a number of times, so they knew the biomass that was there. Denver Water gave money that they didn't have to give at this point in time in the agreement. And with a partnership with a private individual there, we rechanneled and planted willows and put in riffles in that portion of the river. Colorado Parks and Wildlife shocked it a little over a week after we had said the project is done. There was a 45% increase in biomass in that little over 1 mile of river. So we know that we can do good things, and we know with the Colorado River Cooperative Agreement, the ability to use Denver's system, the ability to move water, the ability to have partners that work with us and not against us, we can save the Fraser and the Colorado River. And I'm most proud of being able to be part of that. And I think no one here yet knows the benefits that the CRCA is going to provide in the future, because we haven't been able to implement them yet.
Thank you.
I would just add that one can only imagine the courage it would take for a Lurleen Curran, the manager of Grand County, to sit down and pull this together from the West Slope perspective, given the history of animosity between the West Slope and Denver Water, and just want to pay tribute to that.
Pretty amazing. So as many of you may know, and if you don't, I'll just mention it super quick. So
after Two Forks, we moved into this era where we're going to conserve water, we're going to reuse water. But if we have to develop new water, how are we going to do it? And with the help of the environmental community, the consensus was we would do it by expanding Gross Reservoir. We wouldn't be damming any new rivers. We would go with something that was already there, minimizing disruption to the environment, yada, yada, yada. So flash forward to today. I don't know that anybody was really talking about climate change back then, but now we're at a point where obviously climate change is having a profound impact on the ability of our mountain snowpacks to generate stream flow. We are at a point where people are saying now, here was this great project, GROSS. A number of environmental groups have supported it, like Trout Unlimited, but in recent years we've begun to see some environmental opposition to it, sort of ironic in a way. So I'd like, and it raises some interesting permitting questions as well, which I'd like these guys to address. But let's start, David, tell us about Trout Unlimited's perspective on the GROSS expansion, and to the extent that you can, help us understand the environmental groups who are supporting it and the concerns of those who are suing to stop it.
So I'll start with Trout Unlimited. We certainly didn't start out supporting the idea of expanding Gross Reservoir. We felt, I think, at some level in organization, an obligation to at least be open-minded to it, because we had literally proposed it as an alternative to another project. It would have been rather hypocritical to say, hell no, we're not even willing to talk about it. That said, we knew it was still going to have significant impacts, and those impacts needed to be dealt with. And there were multiple years of battling. As Lillian said, people didn't just sit down and agree on very much right out of the gate. I think over time, as some of those relationships were developed and there was a little more trust, one of the things that started to become clear to me certainly, and that I conveyed to our board and our members, is that in the NEPA processes, we try to understand the impacts, and as we try to look at how to mitigate and address those responsibly, we have to realize that our information is dreadfully imperfect. Our ability to predict the future is limited. We can do it to a degree. We need to do it as best we can, but there's a lot of uncertainty, and a great example of that is with some of the unanticipated effects that the Windy Gap project created in the upper Colorado River. Impacts on the fishery downstream of there that we're now working with Northern Water in conjunction with their firming project to try to get remedied. And with that in mind, it made the concept of learning by doing really critical, because that represented a change in mitigation, and not simply being, we have to predict it now, lay it out there and do it. It became a process of saying, all right, we know we have these resources, money to do restoration work, to change the channel where needed, water to be able to be applied where most needed, and system flexibility to be able to look at how things are operated to create the most opportunity for the stream's health. And with those resources on the table, the idea of learning by doing was, let's leave it flexible. Let's have some adaptive management opportunities so that in the future, as we see changing conditions or as we see unexpected challenges, we are working together to address those, as opposed to having closed the chapter on what mitigation is, on what restoration is, and not having the opportunity to go forward. And with that in mind, as we looked at the various resources that were part of that project and that Denver Water was willing to put on the table in terms of money for restoration of the stream, projects like the Fraser Flats project that Lillian described, and the opportunity to have water at really critical times, even as we knew we would be seeing less water during some of the peak flow and higher flow periods. We came to the conclusion that we thought that the best opportunity to save the Fraser River from the trajectory it has been on in steady decline was to join forces, to work together through this learning by doing process, use these resources and apply them to the benefit of the river. And so we ultimately did come to the conclusion, as Jim described, that the river will be better off under the project. That is not a point of view that is shared across the entire environmental community. I think in the environmental community, we often have the tendency to think of water utilities as a monolithic group of water buffaloes, and probably there's the same tendency for folks to assume the environmental community is a monolith of folks who all think alike. There's a lot of diverse points of view. So, there are groups who are very concerned about any further depletions from the Colorado River, understandably, because we have big river problems. I mean, the overall system imbalance right now is a major challenge that our state and the downstream states are trying to grapple with. Further depletions, understandably, do create more challenges on that front. And then there are a lot of local impacts in Boulder County where they have not yet had the kinds of negotiations efforts to be able to build those agreements as Grant County did, and communities that are still concerned about those. And so those local impacts are leading many folks to continue to oppose the project, and some that are currently litigating it, in fact, against the permits.
Yeah, so Jim, tell us more about that, how you guys are wrestling with that, both with the fact that climate change may reduce the flows that you plan to tap to help fill growth, and also this split in the environmental community that you've been working with so diligently these last few years.
In terms of the climate change, we have a climate scientist on our staff, and we do a lot of research in climate modeling and analysis in terms of our long-range planning about the implications of a warming planet and what that means for water supply in our system, as well as demands in our system. And right now, what the models show on the continental divide is we may get more precipitation, we may get less precipitation along the continental divide in the area of our water projects. But because it's going to get warming, it's going to come in different forms. There's going to be more snow, or more, I will hope more snow, more rain, less snow. We're already seeing earlier runoff, and obviously more severe weather events. We saw that in 2013. We're probably seeing it today, given the snow conditions that we're seeing in the mountains. It doesn't mean the end of climate change. It means the implications of a warming climate on weather events. And to me, what that argues is additional storage, because what the storage provides is that system flexibility that I talked about to be able to capture water and manage it for both our system and for the environment. So to me, the argument is we need to enlarge gross reservoir in the face of climate change. In terms of, we are going through litigation. The 404 permit that's been issued is being challenged. We're awaiting a license modification from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and we are having discussions with Boulder County as to the scope of Boulder County's land use authority, particularly under 1041 under the project. Clearly, it's a major construction project. Jeff Martin is the project leader. He's here. He'll tell you that we're going to be disrupting a lot of people's lives over about a 3-year period. We're going to be pouring concrete 24 hours a day. It's a big project. There's no doubt about it. We recognize the impacts to the local community. We have outreach to the local community extensively. We have made over, I forget the statistics, but Jeff is up there all the time. We have a yurt up there. We are sitting in the coffee shops. We are talking to local residents. We are gaining input, and we're incorporating that input into how we design the project. For example, originally we were going to take aggregate and mine aggregate from above the high water line on the project. The residents told us, well, that's going to be a terrible visual scar. And so we looked and realized that we could mine the aggregate from at a point below the high water line of the project and mitigate that impact. We have worked to reduce truck trips by 75% or so up and down the canyon. We're talking to the community about when those truck trips should occur. Obviously not when school buses are on the road. Safety is the major issue. So in terms of Denver Water's willingness to have those conversations with the local community and with Boulder County, it's there, and I would argue it's been proven by the track record of the Colorado River Cooperative Agreement. That is with or without Boulder County regulation under 1041. It's our commitment to be able to sit down with the local community and reach those agreements and do the responsible and right thing by the local community. That having been said, 1041 is a painful and awful process. You've been on it on your side. I would argue it's painful for all sides, but it's kind of similar to learning by doing. We can go through that process and we can come out the other side, and it's better, I think, to sit down and work it out in the right way, because it allows us greater flexibility to do things that might not even frankly be required, but might go above and beyond what the county could otherwise impose upon us.
Okay, excellent. So in the time we have left, quickly, one of the wonkiest parts of the water world is permitting. And it hasn't, I don't think it doesn't seem to be getting any cheaper or any easier. But, so I wanted to talk about, Doug, give us your perspective on where we are in terms of permitting. And then we want to take just a few minutes to talk about the Colorado Water Plan and how that is going to, how the hope with that is that it will help guide all of the water players in the state toward a more sustainable future. But tell us a little bit about permitting from your perspective and where you think we're going with it.
Sure. So EPA has a very serious responsibility with respect to all of these projects, and we do take it seriously. You know, the president has asked all of us on infrastructure projects in particular, and is going through a process right now on infrastructure projects to try and make the permitting process go more quickly. The 1041 process is probably torturous, but the permitting process probably isn't much better on each end. And so that is something that we are working on. And certainly, when it comes to water projects in Region 8, you know, I prioritize those for the region and said when they come up, they need to go to the front of the line, because it's not just Colorado that's having water issues. There are other western states as well, and we need to make sure that they're moving quickly. We're working on a couple of reservoir projects up in Wyoming right now that we prioritized and want to make sure that they move well. Just as important as permitting, though, is NEPA. NEPA, it can be a very long and can be a very difficult process, particularly because at EPA we're not necessarily the one leading the NEPA process. We're commenting and working with other federal agencies on it. And you know, our job, this is where our job is very serious. Our job is to make certain that that all of the potential impacts are being looked at and that they are being accounted for in the NEPA process, so that, you know, so that they're transparent and they're public, and that the agency that's moving the project can try and mitigate them as much as possible. There's no upside to EPA not doing its job very well under NEPA, zero. Because what happens is it becomes a source of litigation, and a project that may move along or should move along doesn't because of the litigation, because impacts weren't properly accounted for. So we've taken I've taken, and certainly I know the region has taken very seriously our NEPA responsibilities. Having said that, EPA does have a broader role under NEPA. It can be a broader role than just the media that we're responsible for under statute. The way the act is written, we have an oversight role, basically. And what I've tried to do at Region 8 is take that role seriously, but also make folks understand that we are responsible, that we need to stick to our lane with respect to the areas that we are knowledgeable on. You know, historic preservation is not necessarily an expertise of the agency. Clean water is, clean air is, land use, you know, what certain land issues are. So that's where we've been going on these projects. What I will say, very quickly, when it comes to permitting, we also are seeing some interest or some increase in UIC, underground injection control requests for underground upper aquifer storage. And I think that is going to be an area where we're going to see more activity. We just worked on one, it went very well. Not quite as fast as I would like for it to have gone, but you know, it certainly is going to be an area of water, an area that is going to be plumb, I think, for additional water storage for water users around the state and hopefully across the West.
Interesting, great, thank you. So let's spend the last few minutes. So the Colorado Water Plan is another very innovative document that is seeking to steer Colorado forward in a very consensus-based way, both in terms of environment, ag, water conservation, recycling, some new project development. So for the time that we have left, I'd like each of you, we can start with David, tell us in a very pithy and concise way what your hopes and fears are for the water plan.
On the hope side, I will say one of the things that's in the water plan that we've been really pleased with is learning from Grand County's example, actually, and stream management plans being flagged as a key need to be put in place for 80% of the state's priority watersheds across the state over the, I believe it's by 2030, if I recall the target date for that. Our community knows far too little about the real, and certainly in a quantified way, the real needs of our rivers and streams, and that creates a real imbalance and a challenge. I think it's a challenge not just for us, but probably for water utilities when they try to work with the environmental community. If you don't know what you need, it's sort of hard to go in and have a very productive negotiation. And I think the example of what happened in Grand County shows the value of investing in that, and we're really pleased that the water plan looks at the state making investments in that to get that kind of information more broadly generated. And that's been evolving into some more stakeholder-oriented processes as well, so that's really positive. Fear is that the energy that we're seeing right now will dissipate, and this will end up being another one of many historical volumes about water policy that gets put on a shelf, gathers dust, and doesn't turn into future action.
My hope is that we can be a productive partner with the state of Colorado and water utilities and other stakeholders. And moving along, to help them achieve their goals. Frankly, my fear would be that we step outside of our authority and become an impediment to projects that otherwise should be done.
That the state would step outside?
No, that we would, EPA would.
Yeah, okay.
There's been a lot of talk about funding the state water plan, and I'm not sure. Everybody in this room might have a different definition about what that means. From Denver Water's perspective, it doesn't mean money for water projects. We pay for our own, we pay our own way. But I think for me, the hope is a greater focus on watershed health and these stream management plans that David talked about. My fear is that money won't solve the problem. There are some key policy issues in this state that need to be solved. One relates to the permitting challenge. Denver Water's been through 15 years of a gauntlet of sequential governmental reviews by federal and state, 10 federal and state agencies, each with a different culture, each with a different approach, each with a different modeling regimen. And we've got to find a better way to pull the family of regulatory agencies together and get the same story for the regulated community so we can move forward with things that the water plan identifies. The second thing is that the water plan doesn't address the fundamental problem that was brought up in the first panel, which is how do we deal with growth in Colorado, and how do we link water supply and growth in Colorado and grow up and not out. Sprawl is the enemy of sustainability in this state. That's why we're talking about ATMs and other ways to avoid agriculture coming out of production. And it's just not an efficient way to grow. And we are not having a serious conversation in this state. And there's not, frankly, the political courage to have that serious conversation in this state. And that's my fear, that we're not going to get there.
Well, I think the Colorado Water Plan was a growth out of the roundtables from all the different drainages, and making us all have to agree on what was in our part of the water plan and what was in everyone else's part of the water plan at least made us have a conversation from a state perspective, west slope, east slope, and that was a good thing. Also, the state continuing to pull together those roundtable people and other people that are interested once a year to a big meeting where you have to sit at a table where people you don't know or maybe you don't really like, and you have to discuss the issues. I am a firm believer in face-to-face meetings and getting to know people, because when that happens, good things happen. Anyone that knows me will tell you I hate doodle polls. I want to see your face. I want to see how you react to what I'm saying, and I want to be able to react to what you're saying. To me, that is an important component to the state water plan, and not letting it turn to dust. To all of us making sure that we try to follow that through and work on it and stay involved in water. It's the first step to the state working together and realizing they're a state They're a whole unit that has one major thing in mind, and that is preservation of water, use of water, and how we protect our environment.
So you plan the work, and then you work the plan. And I think we're really to the point where the water plan was a great start, but I think people are ready to start moving forward on actually implementing some of the projects that are listed in the plan or listed in the basin implementation plans. And Jim mentioned funding as a huge issue, and I agree, but also prioritization of projects. There's a number of basins with a number of projects, and someone's going to have to sit down and figure out which projects move forward. And some will move forward first. Some will have to be timed and scheduled out. That's just a capital development plan, part of that. But I think it's pretty critical that we start moving forward on actually developing some of these projects. And then toward what Doug said, which I was very appreciative, the permit he was talking about for an ASR project that was down in the South Metro region, which thank you, and I think that those projects are going to become critical, but the linkage of supply and quality is becoming huge now. And I think as the resource becomes more scarce and we see more reuse, we're going to have to start grappling with some of these water quality issues. And you can't turn away a project that might be viable simply because you're afraid of addressing some of those quality issues. I think we're all going to have to do that. There's just no way that we can get beyond that. So that's my biggest concern.
Great, thanks very much. So you guys, thanks for being up here. And I know there are a lot of people who came today just because you're here and that they have some great questions for you. So we've saved some time here at the end. Please take this opportunity to ask away.
Jim and Lisa, water and bottom end is a retail business, and you had to beg your customers not to buy your products in 2002, facing an emergency. And I'd like to know how you thought about the revenue side of that and the consequences, and that whole must have been horrible kind of stuff you had to consider as you went through that process.
We actually tell our customers every day not to use our product. So we're a monopoly, right? We serve a product that's absolutely essential for human life, and we have to sell it at the lowest possible price, and we have to try and convince our customers not to use our product. That's a great business model, right? So part of it is the public education of being efficient, driving efficiency in water use among our customers. And the other piece, I think, is developing that connection of responsibility of here's where the water comes from, here are the impacts associated with it, here's what it takes to deliver it to you. It's not just a product, but it's a service that in comparison to a bottle of water, you got 24/7, you turn on a tap and that water is there for you every single day. So it's a number of different messaging and communication with our customers.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think it's still one of the lowest priced commodities out there, right? And I think that we don't realize how incredibly blessed we are. And if people had to wait to take a shower, like if you were sitting in traffic for 50 minutes, all of a sudden people are all talking about transportation. If you had to wait when you turned on the tap to take a hot shower, all of a sudden water, people I think would start valuing it a little bit differently. But it's really just education and being mindful, right? And having people understand that when we're asking you not to use the product, we still have to replace pipes in the ground. And that's just a fact. And then that's just getting that messaging out. That's a good question.
I have a question about the future and the past. The future with respect to aquifer storage and reservoir. Where do you think the science lies in terms of contaminants, endocrine disruptors and pesticides going into that recharge? And in terms of the past, I'm sure the prior panel was quite aware that preceding the steps to go towards veto was an EPA staff rating of the EIS of an unsatisfactory and inadequate. And yet, recently, the agency has dropped its ratings that it gives to EISs and does not provide comments on alternatives.
So we did drop our ratings. I think we are providing comments and alternatives. I'm certainly seeing them when the NEPA documents come through to me. So I think we do that. But yeah, we did drop the rating system because the rating system really didn't work very well, quite frankly. The characterization, and this really frustrated me, and I talked to headquarters about it and said, look, we got to do something about this, because the characterization of every project basically came out to be sort of, and I forget what the rating, frankly, what the ratings were, but the impression was always left that that was inadequate. So what we're doing now is providing narrative ratings, which I think work a lot better and allows us to go into a lot more detail and provide the nuances of a project and what we're trying to say about a project. So I think the dropping of the ratings, we're actually going through a process, our CEQ is going through a process right now of further trying to refine the NEPA process so that it works better. It's frankly more informative for the public. You know, honestly, you looked at some of the NEPA documents that came out. Part of the purpose of a NEPA document is to inform the public. It was an ultimate failure. You get these 100-page documents out there that were written in a language that frankly people didn't understand. It communicated nothing to them. And it didn't allow for, I think, adequate public participation. We've started taking our NEPA documents, and you know, I don't want to artificially limit it, and I don't, but I tell people if you can't get it down to like 10 pages, I need to know why. I need to know why you need 100 pages to say something, and I need to know that you're actually going into issues that are relevant to the project, because at times NEPA documents can spin out of control a little bit. So with respect to NEPA, I think the object is to try and make these documents and make the process work better so that frankly the public can better understand it. One of the goals of the agencies is better risk communication. We want to better communicate to the public you know, the risks they face from any given contaminant, from the area they live in, if they live within a Superfund site. You know, better give them better information. And I think this is part of that process.
I just wanted to address your other question about injection, and it really was part of what Doug and I worked through with some of our members in terms of the regulatory control over injection, because of course the state has primacy on the drinking water side, but the agency has primacy in the UIC program. And so when you're talking about injecting fully treated drinking water, and yet there's you know, a constituent in that water that causes concern that may have been identified on the other side of the house, you know, that it's a bit of a debate and an argument as to you can drink it, but you can't inject it because of the concern that you might be, you know, have for the aquifer quality. And that's just one of the water quality issues. And I don't know, Jim, if you want to talk at all about the orthophosphate issue, but that's another issue that we're looking at in terms of water treatment and water reuse. You know, the additions of these contaminant treatment programs or protocols is going to create even more additional water quality challenges.
Hi, I have two stormwater-related questions, and anyone else can answer it. The first one, before I begin, I just want to say I want to echo Ms. Curran's compliment to Dave Little, if he's still here. I used to live by Gross Dam Reservoir in the area, and he came to my home and met with the neighbors, and you know, he was very gracious. This is many years ago, and it did create a bridge in terms of discussions. I would say the majority of neighbors are still very opposed to the whole expansion project, but it was still a nice thing to do. The first question I have, and maybe Mr. Lockhead should answer this one, but you mentioned the 2013 flood through Boulder County, and the question I have, and I haven't been able to find data on this, I'm a student at Red Rocks Community College now in the water quality program. how much more acre feet would have been captured if the dam had been raised at that point? And maybe you don't know the answer, but I'd love to find out if there's someone who knows an answer. No one else knows? Okay. Okay, all right. Well, the second question I have is maybe related to water law. It's also a technical challenge too, but in many Asian countries, stormwater is often handled by dry wells or some sort of mechanism to store it in the ground. We can't do this right now in Colorado, I don't believe, because of our water laws. Do you ever anticipate a change to that? And maybe there's some technical reasons why we shouldn't do that either.
We've had issues of the intersection of water law and stormwater management, and obviously green infrastructure is a movement that is worldwide of replicating natural drainage patterns, not only in terms of maintaining base flows and streams, but using the natural cleansing process of having water seep through rather than having it just channeled through concrete structures and dumped in with everything else that goes with it into a river or a stream. Unfortunately, in Colorado, in the South Platte River, it's a return flow based stream. It was developed from the top to the bottom, and the water gets reused 7 times between Denver and the state line. There's about 2 million acre feet of water flow in the Platte River, and it's about 4 million acre feet of diversions in the Platte River. So all those downstream farmers get real riled up when they see an upstream municipality wanting to retain stormwater. And so there's an education process about what the real impacts of that are. But that having been said, Denver is obviously working on a major project right now to put in green infrastructure into the South Platte River. Denver Water is working on a project to transform the Highline Canal from a highly inefficient water delivery structure to a bioswale, which will retain stormwater and basically maintain the recreational amenity of the Highline Canal, which is a crown jewel for the Denver metropolitan area, and enhance the tree canopy and natural vegetation that's along the canal and avoid wasting water through the very inefficient structure. We're also redeveloping our campus, and we're going to do rainwater capture, for example, on our campus, where we filed a water right to be able to do that. So we're trying to use water law to promote the innovation of some of these more efficient ways to manage water more holistically through the whole water cycle.
My name is Andrew Ream. I just wanted to thank, as a middle-aged, I'll say, water professional, an issue like Two Forks, just the current panel, the previous, sort of sharing their experience and history, and I know I learned a lot, and I appreciate everyone's time. But the point's been made about that being a potential inflection point for water supply planning, water resources. I'm curious as what I kind of see as maybe a coming inflection point, something that's referred to, and it came up a little bit indirectly a couple times, but direct potable reuse. And the concept that Prairie Waters certainly has an element of it, but the 30-mile pipeline makes it a little different. I think Castle Rock's looking into it. El Paso Water is piloting it. Southern California, Vegas, kind of growing arid, semi-arid areas of the country. And I'm just curious of the panels, where technology and maybe finance aren't as much of an issue, but I think it's kind of public perception as well as changes from how things have been done. I'm curious of the panel's thoughts on that potential emerging area.
And I'll turn it over to one of the other panelists, but I tell you from EPA's perspective, the Office of Water is looking closely at additional reuse opportunities, particularly in states with a lot of oil and gas development for produced water. What can you do with produced water? How can it better be used? There's evaporation, there's some underground injection that's going on, but we're looking closely because whether it's Colorado or any other western state that relies upon storage for water, conservation and reuse is going to have to be a big part of that in order to meet the coming needs the needs that we're going to be seeing. So I would, one area in particular is produced water, and we're really working to try and find out, okay, what can we approve? What are the technologies out there for, whether it be additional treatment or any other mechanism for allowing the water to be used for different purposes, whether it's dust suppression or, you know, any other use, you know, outside of using it for drinking water. Anybody?
This is for Mr. Lockheed. My name is Eric Dole with Garver, and I was just curious, I think right now the turbines at the bottom of Gross is about 7.5 megawatts, and you're going to raise that. Did you use the increase in green energy that you're going to produce from that in any of the PR campaigns and carbon footprint reduction?
Turn this over to Jeff. Do you want to answer that?
Yeah, so after we raise the reservoir, we'll create about 25% more kilowatt hours to the grid than we do right now. We actually haven't used it much as a campaign point of purpose and need, because it's not. It's an incidental byproduct, but there is a benefit that's going to be provided for it.
Okay. And has the panel looked at deep well injection? They put turbines on them now to create energy when you put it in the ground.
I don't think we're looking at that specifically. I would mention that Denver Water has a goal of being net energy neutral as an entire utility from soup to nuts by 2020. We are in the process of building a new treatment plant that will not only be energy neutral, but will be a net energy producer. We're going to be selling water back to the grid from this water treatment plant that we're building. And from a reuse, recycling standpoint, I mentioned our campus redevelopment. Our administration building is going to have an eco machine in it where we're going to treat our own wastewater and use it for irrigation and toilet flushing. And getting that approved in Colorado has proven to be a monumental task. It took a piece of legislation to ask CDPHE to add toilet flushing to the uses for recycled water. We had to work with the state plumbing board. Nobody knows in Colorado how to regulate these things, even though they're used. So we wanted to be the tip of the spear on this. I'm not sure we quite knew what we were getting into, but it's a challenge in Colorado.
Okay. I just want to thank you all so much for being here with us this morning and helping us trace the path that we've been on since Two Forks. And please join me in thanking our panelists. And I just invite you all to remain seated for a few minutes. Tom Check is going to come back up and lead us in a short wrap-up.
That was fascinating, wasn't it? Just a few real brief closing comments. And one is, the gold rush of Colorado, 1859, continues today. We all see it with the people moving here, with the jobs being created. There's a lot of opportunity for wealth generation, and in the middle of all that, how do you protect our beautiful environment? That's a challenge. Been a challenge for a long time. What was fascinating to me on the first panel was we saw the curtains parted for a while to see the inner workings of government and politics at the highest levels. I mean, that is truly fascinating, how these sorts of things come together. Sometimes, and a lot of it relates to personalities and ability to cooperate and persistence and timing. Timing was mentioned on this, the success of the permit, in that lightning struck, you had the environmental president, you had things just come together, and then after it happened, you had the environmental community celebrating quite joyously, and Jim, you mentioned Denver Water had a bad hangover. Not so good. I was really proud of the panels today. There was no name calling other than green. They called each other green weenies once in a while. I was very proud of how that went, so thank you very much. I had one last thought. Oh, yeah. This is a takeaway from today, and that is that one person can really make a difference in the world, whether it's water or innovation or jobs or whatever. If you have the courage to stand up for your convictions and then do it, even though you don't have a lot of support, one person can make a big difference. And you don't have to be the head administrator at a huge federal agency. You can be a local water provider and make a difference with what, Lisa? With leading change in a growing southern community of Metro Denver. One person can make a big difference in preserving historic records or in leading political efforts from the West Slope, Chris, to try to get things to go in a way that's maybe better statewide. So one person can really make a difference, and we heard that story in the first panel. Absolutely fascinating. That's it.
Thank you so much, Tom. And just to reiterate that, I think I just commend you all for the leadership that you demonstrated and the roles that you've played and continue to play in leading Colorado forward. So thank you. Thank you all for coming today. It was wonderful having you all here to join us for these conversations. I want to let you know about a couple of follow-up steps. We are going to be sending you an evaluation in your email, and I encourage you to fill it out and just help us understand the value that you found in this program, what we did well and what we could improve. I'd encourage you to stay connected to the host organizations here today, the One World, One Water Center, Colorado Trout Unlimited, and Water Education Colorado. We have a ton of great resources to help keep you informed. You can get on our email list. We are going to be sending out some kind of video recording using the great footage that was captured here today. That may take us a little bit to package that, but we will send you an email and let you know when that's available. And we hope to see you again soon. And please join me again in thanking all of the panelists that shared with us here today.